In the early 1700s, if you opened an atlas published by the most respected cartographers in Europe, you would find something extraordinary. Stretching across the heart of Asia, covering millions of square miles, was a region labelled with a single name, Tartary, not as a footnote, not as unexplored territory, but as a defined empire, with cities, rivers, and borders clearly marked. For over 2 centuries, this name appeared on map after map, produced by cartographers who had never met, working in different countries, using different sources. Then, by the late 1800s, something impossible happened. The name vanished. Not because of war, not because of conquest, not because of any recorded collapse. It simply disappeared from every map, replaced by new territories and nations that claim no connection to what came before. No modern country remembers Tartary. No ethnic group identifies with it. No language preserves it. It is as if an empire covering half a continent was administratively erased from human memory within a single generation, and almost no one noticed. Before we dive into this mystery, if you're enjoying this content, using your hype points on this video helps the channel more than you possibly know. It truly makes a massive difference in getting these stories out to more people. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review helps out so much and means the world to us. Also, feel free to comment what time it is for you and where in the world you're listening from. Only if you want to, of course. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It creates this amazing global community of curious minds. And if you enjoy the content, subscribing really helps us continue making these deep dives into the mysteries that keep us all awake at night. I want to give a massive thank you to Party Pat, Michael, Felix, Daryl and Tony for suggesting this topic. You all saw something here that needed to be explored, and I hope this story does it justice. There are empires that fall in fire, civilizations that crumble beneath the weight of invasion, famine or revolution. Their endings are documented, mourned, dissected by historians for centuries. We know when Rome fell. We know how the Aztec Empire collapsed. We have dates, battles, treaties and survivors who recorded what happened. But what do you do with an empire that simply vanishes from maps? Not through conquest, not through plague or earthquake, not even through slow decline, just gone, erased, replaced by new names, new borders, new explanations that somehow feel incomplete. For over 200 years, European cartographers marked a vast region across Asia with a single name, Tartary, sometimes written as Tartaria. It stretched across millions of square miles. It appeared on maps produced by the most respected geographers of their time. It was not a rumour. It was not folklore. It was printed, published, and sold as fact. Then, by the late 1800s, it disappeared. No final war was recorded. No collapse was mourned. The name simply faded from use, replaced by a patchwork of new nations and territories. And mainstream history offers a tidy explanation. Tartary was never really a unified empire. It was just a vague European label for the lands of Turkic and Mongol peoples, a placeholder, a misunderstanding. But if that explanation is true, why does it feel like only part of the story? Why do maps from multiple centuries created by cartographers who had never met all agree on the boundaries? Why do architectural patterns from that era appear across continents with unsettling uniformity? And why, when you start digging into the timeline of the 19th century, do certain events, wars, fairs, population shifts, and education reforms all seem to align in ways that feel too coordinated to be accidental? This is not a story about proving an empire existed. It is a story about what happens when a name disappears and no one seems to remember why. It is a story about maps that contradict the narrative, buildings that should not exist, and a timeline that fractures under scrutiny. This is the story of Tartaria, or what might have been Tartaria, or what we are told was never Tartaria at all. Let us begin where all mysteries of this kind begin, with something we can see, touch, and verify. Something that should not be controversial. Something as simple as a map. Chapter 1. Tartary on the old maps. Guillaume Delisle was not a speculative cartographer. He was meticulous, precise. his maps were used by explorers, merchants, and kings. When he produced his map of Asia in the early 1700s, he did not label regions based on fantasy or hearsay. He used the best available sources of his time: travel accounts, trade records, Jesuit missionaries, and diplomatic correspondence. And in the centre of that map, covering an enormous swath of the continent, he wrote, "Great Tartary," not as a footnote, not as a mythical land on the edge of the known world, as a defined region with borders, rivers, and cities marked within it. To the south, he labelled Chinese Tartary. To the west, Muscovite Tartary. These were not poetic embellishments. They were geographic distinctions, used consistently across multiple editions of his work. Johann Baptist Homann, working around the same time in Germany, produced similar maps. So did Nicolas Sanson in France. So did Hermann Moll in England. All respected names, all showing Tartary as a massive acknowledged region stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. The term itself, Tartary, comes from Tartar, a name Europeans used to describe various Turkic and Mongol peoples. The etymology is messy. Some trace it back to the Tatars, a Mongol subgroup. Others suggest it derives from Tartarus, the Greek underworld, a label applied by fearful Europeans who saw these eastern peoples as barbaric invaders. But regardless of the origin, the name stuck. For centuries it appeared on maps, in encyclopedias, in diplomatic letters. It was real enough that travellers wrote about passing through Tartary. Merchants described trading in Tartary. Explorers mapped routes across Tartary. And then, by the mid to late 1800s, it was gone. Not slowly, not gradually fading as understanding improved. It was replaced. New labels appeared. The Russian Empire expanded eastward, absorbing territories. China redefined its borders. Central Asian Khanates were named individually. Mongolia became distinct. Turkic peoples were divided into ethnic and national categories. The explanations make sense on paper. Europe's understanding of Asia improved. Imperialism carved the continent into colonies and spheres of influence. Nationalism created new identities. The old vague term Tartary was no longer useful, so it disappeared from use. But here is the unsettling part. The transition was too clean. Empires do not vanish from history without leaving scars. When Rome fell, we have centuries of documentation about the collapse. When the Mongol Empire fragmented, we have chronicles from China, Persia, and Russia describing the chaos. When the Ottoman Empire declined, we have diplomatic records, treaties, and revolts. But Tartary? Nothing. No recorded final capital, no documented succession crisis, no treaty marking its dissolution. It simply stopped being mentioned. The name was replaced, and the world moved on as if it had never mattered. Conspiracy theorists look at this pattern and ask a simple question. How does something that large disappear from collective memory without a fight? Mainstream historians have an answer. It was never unified. There was no Tartarian government, no single ruler, no cohesive empire, just a collection of peoples that Europeans grouped together out of ignorance. And that answer is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Because even if Tartary was never a centralized empire, the question remains. Why did the name vanish so completely? Why do modern encyclopedias barely mention it? Why do most people today, even those with an interest in history, have no idea it ever appeared on maps? The absence of a clear answer creates space for doubt, and doubt once planted grows quickly. When you examine the maps closely, other details emerge. Cities are marked within Tartary. Trade routes cross through it. Rivers divide it into sub-regions. These are not the markings of a mythical land. They are the markings of a known territory, however imperfectly understood. Some maps show a capital city. Others show multiple centres of power. The borders shift slightly between cartographers, but the core region remains consistent, from the Ural Mountains in the west to the Pacific coast in the east, from Siberia in the north to the borders of China and Persia in the south. This was not a small area. It was vast, larger than Europe, larger than the continental United States. If it was merely a placeholder term. Why was it used so consistently for so long? And why, when it disappeared, did no single nation claim to be its successor? Russia absorbed much of the territory, but Russian history does not mention conquering Tartary. China expanded into regions labelled as Tartary, but Chinese records do not describe a Tartarian empire. The local peoples, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Mongols, Turkmen, have their own histories, but none claim continuity with Tartary. It is as if the name existed in a bubble, acknowledged by outsiders, ignored by insiders, and then erased by everyone. Cartographic history is full of mistakes. Phantom islands that appeared on maps for centuries before being proven false, rivers that flowed in the wrong direction, coastlines drawn from sailors' reports that turned out to be wildly inaccurate. But Tartary was not a phantom island. It was not a navigational error. It was a label applied to a real place, inhabited by real people, crossed by real travellers. The question is not whether the region existed. The question is whether the label meant something more than historians are willing to acknowledge. Chapter 2. What mainstream history says. Let us pause and acknowledge what historians actually say about Tartary, because the conspiracy theory gains traction partly by misrepresenting the mainstream narrative. Academic consensus holds that Tartary was never a political entity. It was a geographic label, a European convenience. Maps of the era often grouped distant, poorly understood regions under broad terms. Africa was once labelled simply as Ethiopia or Guinea on maps, even though those names represented vastly different peoples and kingdoms. The same logic applied to Tartary. European cartographers in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries had limited direct knowledge of Inner Asia. The Silk Road provided trade routes, but political control of those routes shifted constantly. The Mongol Empire had fractured. Successor states rose and fell. Turkic tribes migrated. Russian expansion moved eastward. China's Qing dynasty controlled vast territories, but maintained closed borders to most Europeans. So mapmakers did what mapmakers do when information is scarce. They generalised. Tartary became shorthand for the lands where Tartar peoples live. It was not meant to imply a single government or culture. It was a placeholder, waiting for better information. By the 19th century, that information arrived. Russian explorers mapped Siberia. British agents surveyed Central Asia during the Great Game. Archaeological expeditions documented ruins and cities. Ethnographers categorised languages and customs. The vague label Tartary no longer made sense. It was replaced by specific names: Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Mongolia, Manchuria. This is the accepted explanation, and it is supported by evidence. We have records of exploration. We have ethnographic studies. We have treaties that formalised borders. The transition from Tartary to modern nation-states is documented. But here is where the conspiracy theory finds traction. The explanation, while accurate, feels curiously sterile. History is messy. Transitions are chaotic. Empires collapse over decades or centuries, leaving behind literature, monuments, oral traditions and descendants who remember. Yet Tartary leaves almost none of that. There is no Tartarian language widely remembered. No Tartarian architectural style clearly defined. No cultural continuity claimed by any modern nation. It is as if the name was cut cleanly from the historical record, leaving no roots behind. Conspiracy theorists do not dispute that Europeans grouped peoples together. They dispute the completeness of the narrative. They ask, if Tartary was just a vague label, why does the architecture from that era look so uniform? If Tartary was never a centralised power, why do star forts built during that period appear on every continent with nearly identical designs? If Tartary was merely a misunderstanding, why does its disappearance coincide so neatly with massive global upheavals in the 19th century? The mainstream explanation is not wrong, but it leaves questions unanswered. And unanswered questions, in the age of the internet, become breeding grounds for alternative theories. Academic historians point to the diversity of peoples living in the region: Kazakhs, Mongols, Tatars, Tungusic tribes, Turkmen, Uzbeks, each with distinct languages, customs and political structures. There was no unity, no shared identity. The idea of a Tartarian empire is, in their view, a projection, a misreading of geography as politics. Travel accounts from the era support this. European visitors to Central Asia described fragmented khanates, nomadic tribes, and isolated trading posts. They did not describe a centralized government or unified culture. Marco Polo, writing centuries earlier, described the Mongol Empire but made no mention of Tartary as a distinct political entity. So where did the name come from? Linguists trace it to the Mongol invasions of the 13th century. European chroniclers, terrified by the speed and brutality of the Mongol conquests, began calling the invaders Tartars, associating them with Tartarus, the abyss of Greek mythology. The name stuck even after the Mongol Empire fragmented. By the time European cartographers began mapping Asia in detail, Tartary had become a catch-all term. It did not refer to a specific empire. It referred to a vague region beyond the edges of European knowledge, a land of steppes, nomads, and distant cities that few Europeans had visited. This explanation is logical, supported by linguistic evidence and historical records, but it does not address the architectural question. If Tartary was never unified, why does the infrastructure look coordinated? Mainstream historians argue that architectural similarities result from trade, shared technology, and cultural exchange. The Silk Road connected East and West for centuries. Ideas spread, techniques were copied. Similar problems, defense against invaders, harsh climates, limited resources, produced similar solutions. Star forts, for example, emerged independently in multiple regions because the underlying engineering principles are universal. If you want to defend against cannons, you build low, angled walls. The mathematics of ballistics does not change based on geography. This is a strong argument. But it does not explain every anomaly. It does not explain why certain buildings look older than their official construction dates. It does not explain why so many cities raise their street levels during the same narrow time period. It does not explain why the world's fairs were demolished so quickly, leaving almost no physical trace. The mainstream narrative accounts for most of the evidence, but not all of it. And the pieces that do not fit are precisely what fuel the conspiracy theory. Chapter 3. The Architectural Anomaly. Walk through the centre of nearly any major city built or renovated in the 19th century, and you will notice something. The buildings are grand, ornate, far more elaborate than what you would expect from an era that had just begun industrialising. Massive stone structures with domes, columns, intricate carvings, and symmetrical layouts that suggest central planning on a scale that should have taken decades. Yet many of these buildings were reportedly constructed in just a few years. Take the United States Capitol in Washington. Expansion work in the mid-1800s added the massive dome and wings. Official records state it was built using period-appropriate tools and labour. Yet the dome alone weighs over 4,000 tons of cast iron. The construction required precision engineering, foundries capable of producing standardised components, and thousands of workers coordinating across years of labour. Or consider the Palais Garnier in Paris, completed in the late 1800s. Over 1,700 square metres of floor space, marble staircases, gold leaf detailing, a chandelier weighing over 6 tons, built in just over a decade during a period of political instability in France. Or the Royal Albert Hall in London, or the Hungarian Parliament building in Budapest, or the Library of Congress in Washington, all completed in the late 1800s, all featuring similar design elements: domes, columns, symmetry, stonework that appears ancient yet was supposedly built recently. Mainstream historians explain this as the result of Beaux-Arts architecture, a style that emphasized classical forms and grandeur. Wealthy nations invested heavily in public buildings as symbols of power and progress. Industrialization made construction faster and cheaper. Railroads transported materials. Steam-powered machinery replaced manual labor. Standardized techniques allowed for rapid replication of designs. And all of that is true. But conspiracy theorists point to photographs from the era and ask, does it look like these buildings were built quickly? The stonework appears weathered. The foundations seem older than the official dates suggest. In some cases, buildings labelled as new construction in the 1800s have architectural features, vaulted ceilings, load-bearing arches, stone joinery, that match medieval or Renaissance techniques, not industrial era methods. And then there is the question of manpower. Building a structure like the Hungarian parliament required over 100,000 workers, according to official records. That is an enormous labour force, coordinated across decades, in a country that was still developing its industrial base. How were they fed, housed, paid? Where are the records of labour disputes, accidents, supply shortages? The conspiracy theory does not claim these buildings are ancient. It claims they are remnants, leftovers from a previous civilization that was either destroyed or absorbed. Buildings that were repurposed, relabelled and integrated into the new historical narrative of the 19th century. Is that claim provable? No. But it is not easily dismissed either, because the architectural patterns are genuinely puzzling. These buildings do not look like the product of a rapidly industrialising world. They look like monuments from an empire at its peak. And if you start comparing them to structures built in other parts of the world during the same period, the similarities become even stranger. Consider the similarities across continents. The Helsinki Cathedral in Finland, the Buenos Aires Metropolitan Cathedral in Argentina, the Victoria Memorial in India, the San Francisco City Hall in the United States, all built or renovated in the late 1800s or early 1900s. All feature massive domes, classical columns, symmetrical facades and ornate interiors. The official explanation is cultural exchange. Architects travelled, blueprints were shared, European powers exported their architectural preferences to colonies. Wealthy nations competed to build the most impressive public monuments. But look at the precision. Look at the scale. These are not simple copies. They are nearly identical in proportion, in technique, in the mathematical relationships between dome height and building width. It is as if they were built from a master template, not independently designed. Conspiracy theorists point to this uniformity as evidence of inherited knowledge. They suggest that these buildings were not designed in the 1800s at all. They were discovered, reverse-engineered, repurposed from a previous civilization that had mastered large-scale construction. The alternative explanation, that all of this was built from scratch in a few decades by nations that had only recently developed industrial machinery, requires accepting an extraordinary leap in capability. From horse-drawn carts to transcontinental railroads in a generation, from hand tools to steam cranes in a decade, from local craftsmen to coordinated international architectural standards almost overnight. Is it possible? Yes. History is full of rapid transformations. The Industrial Revolution was real. Technological progress accelerates exponentially. But the speed still feels suspicious, especially when you look at what came before and what came after. The architectural golden age of the late 1800s produced monuments that have not been replicated since. Modern buildings, despite having better materials, better machinery, and better engineering knowledge, rarely achieve the same grandeur. Why? If the methods were well documented, if the techniques were perfected during that era, why did they not continue? Why did architecture shift towards simpler, more utilitarian designs in the early 20th century? Mainstream historians explain this as a stylistic shift. Modernism rejected ornamentation in favour of function. Economic pressures after World War I made elaborate buildings impractical. Taste changed. But conspiracy theorists see something else. The knowledge was not developed in the 1800s. It was inherited. And once the inherited structures were repurposed and the old knowledge was absorbed, there was nothing left to build. The Golden Age ended not because tastes changed, but because the source material ran out. This is speculation. But it is speculation built on observable patterns. The buildings exist. The timelines exist. The similarities exist. The mainstream explanations are plausible, but they do not eliminate doubt. Chapter 4. Star Forts and Global Design. If you search for images of star forts, you will find something unsettling. They look identical, not similar. Identical. Perfect geometric shapes, with angled bastions designed to deflect cannon fire. built across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, constructed over a span of several centuries, supposedly by independent nations and cultures who had little to no contact with one another. Yet the designs are nearly interchangeable. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. Star forts represent a specific response to gunpowder warfare. When cannons became powerful enough to destroy traditional medieval walls, military engineers developed a new design: low, angled walls that deflected cannonballs instead of absorbing them. Bastions that allowed defenders to fire along the walls, eliminating blind spots. This design, known as Trace Italian, emerged in Italy in the 1500s and spread rapidly. Spanish engineers built star forts in the Americas. Dutch engineers built them in Asia. French and British engineers built them across Africa and India. Russian engineers built them in Siberia. The explanation makes sense. Military technology spreads quickly during wartime. Nations copy successful designs. Engineers travel, share knowledge, publish treatises. By the 1700s, star fort construction had become standardized. But here is the problem. The forts are too similar, not just in overall shape, but in specific details. The angles of the bastions, the width of the moats, the placement of gates, the interior layouts. You can overlay diagrams of star forts from different continents, and they match almost perfectly. Conspiracy theorists ask, how is that possible if these were independently designed? Even with shared knowledge, you would expect variation. Different climates require different materials. Different terrains demand different foundations. Different cultures prioritize different defensive strategies. Yet star forts in South America look like star forts in India. Star forts in Indonesia look like star forts in Canada. The uniformity suggests something beyond independent invention. It suggests inherited knowledge, a template, a shared source that provided the blueprints. And here is where the Tartaria theory connects. If there was a prior civilization with advanced engineering knowledge, and if that civilization collapsed or was absorbed in the 18th or 19th century, the spread of star forts makes more sense. They were not invented independently. They were copied from ruins, reverse engineered, repurposed. Is there proof of this? No. But the pattern is difficult to ignore. Identical designs appearing globally, with no clear record of how the knowledge spread so completely, so quickly, and so uniformly. Mainstream history explains it through shared technology. Conspiracy theorists explain it through inherited infrastructure. Both explanations fit the evidence. Neither is complete. Look at specific examples. Fort Bourtange in the Netherlands, built in the late 1500s. Fort Ticonderoga in New York, built in the mid-1700s. Almeida in Portugal, built around the same period. Jaffna Fort in Sri Lanka. Gala Fort, also in Sri Lanka. Fort Santiago in the Philippines. Each of these structures is separated by thousands of miles. Each was built by different colonial powers: Dutch, British, Portuguese, Spanish. Each faced different enemies and different strategic challenges. Yet the geometric layout is nearly identical. Pentagon or star-shaped outer walls, angular bastions at each point, interior courtyards, barracks arranged in similar configurations. Engineers of the era did publish treatises. Vauban, the famous French military engineer, wrote extensively about fortification design. His work influenced construction across Europe, but Vauban's treatises were published in French, distributed primarily among European powers. How did the same principles appear in Asia, Africa, and the Americas so quickly? Trade and conquest, historians argue. Colonial powers brought their engineers with them. Knowledge spread through military alliances and captured documents. By the 1700s, star fort design had become common knowledge among any nation engaged in warfare. This is plausible, but it requires accepting that the knowledge spread faster and more uniformly than almost any other technology of the era. Shipbuilding techniques varied widely. Artillery designs differed between nations. Even basic construction methods showed regional variation, but star forts? Nearly uniform. Conspiracy theorists point to another detail. Many star forts appear to predate the official construction records. Archaeological surveys have found foundations beneath some forts that do not match the building materials of the superstructure. In some cases, the lower levels are built from stone types not found locally, suggesting they were transported from distant quarries, an expensive and unlikely choice for military construction. Why would colonial powers go to such lengths? Why not use local materials as they did for other structures? The alternative explanation: the foundations were already there. The forts were built on top of older structures, reusing existing layouts. The colonial powers did not invent the star fort design. They discovered it, recognized its effectiveness, and replicated it. This theory is speculative, but it accounts for the uniformity. If the template came from a single source, a prior civilization with global reach, then the spread of star forts makes sense. It was not independent invention, it was copying. But if that is true, where did the original templates come from? And why is there no record of this prior civilization? The Tartaria theory suggests an answer. The civilization existed but was erased from history. Its knowledge was absorbed, its structures repurposed, and its name forgotten. The star forts are remnants, preserved because they were too useful to destroy. Is this provable? No. But the architectural evidence is real. The forts exist. The similarities exist. The timelines raise questions, and unanswered questions create space for alternative explanations. Chapter 5. The World's Fairs. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the world hosted a series of massive exhibitions. The Chicago World's Fair in the 1890s, the Paris Exposition, the St. Louis World's Fair in the early 1900s. These events were marketed as celebrations of progress, industry, and international cooperation. But they were also architectural marvels. Temporary cities were constructed for these fairs, covering hundreds of acres. Grand buildings with domes, colonnades, fountains, and sculptures. They were designed to impress, to showcase the power of modern engineering and artistry. And then, according to official records, they were destroyed. The buildings were made of staff, a mixture of plaster and fibre. They were meant to last only for the duration of the fair, then be demolished. Wood frames, temporary materials, painted to look like marble and stone, but not actually permanent. That is the official story, but photographs from the era complicate it. The images show structures that look solid, substantial, stone-like in appearance, with weathering and texture that does not match painted plaster. The scale is enormous, buildings several stories high, with foundations that would require months or years to construct properly. Yet official timelines claim these fairs were built in less than 2 years. The Chicago World's Fair, for example, reportedly took just over 2 years to construct. Over 200 buildings, miles of roads and canals, electrical lighting systems, landscaping, all completed on schedule, despite labour strikes, budget overruns and logistical chaos. Conspiracy theorists look at this timeline and ask, is that realistic? Modern construction projects with advanced machinery still take years to complete. A stadium takes 3 to 5 years. A skyscraper takes longer. Yet we are asked to believe that an entire city, built with 1800s technology, was completed in under 2 years, then demolished immediately afterward. The alternative theory is simple. The buildings were not temporary. They were already there. The fairs were held in pre-existing structures, repurposed and relabeled as new construction. After the events ended, the buildings were demolished not because they were fragile, but because their existence contradicted the narrative. Why would anyone do that? The conspiracy theory suggests a reset, a deliberate effort to erase evidence of a prior civilization and replace it with a new historical framework. The fairs served as a cover story, allowing old architecture to be explained as temporary constructions rather than inherited infrastructure. Is this provable? No, but the timeline remains suspicious. The scale remains difficult to explain, and the photographs, when examined closely, do not match the official descriptions of plaster and wood. Look at the details. The Palace of Fine Arts at the Chicago Fair, the Grand Palais in Paris, the Festival Hall in our St. Louis. These structures featured massive columns, intricate moulding, statuary and decorative elements that would take skilled craftsmen months to produce. The official explanation: armies of workers laboured around the clock. Prefabricated components were mass-produced and assembled on site. The buildings only needed to look impressive from a distance, so shortcuts were acceptable. But photographs show detail work that does not match this description. Carved reliefs, sculpted figures, ornamental patterns that vary from column to column, suggesting individual craftsmanship, not mass production. And then there is the demolition. Why destroy everything? Some buildings from the fairs survived. The Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. These buildings prove that permanent construction was possible, so why demolish the rest? The official reason? Maintenance costs. The temporary structures were deteriorating. They were built for a single event, not long-term use. Keeping them would have been impractical. But other cities preserved their fair buildings and turned them into museums, parks and cultural centres. Why did some cities choose preservation, while others chose complete demolition? Was it purely economic, or was there another reason? Conspiracy theorists point to another pattern. The fairs were often followed by fires. The Chicago Fair ended, and parts of the city burned. The same happened after fairs in other cities. Fires are a convenient way to erase evidence. They destroy records, blueprints, and the physical structures themselves. Accidental? Perhaps. But the frequency is notable, enough to raise questions about whether the fires were entirely natural or served a purpose. The world's fairs remain one of the most visually compelling pieces of the Tartaria puzzle. The photographs are real, the timelines are documented, the scale is undeniable, and the official explanations, while plausible, do not eliminate all doubt. Were the fairs temporary constructions or repurposed remnants? The evidence supports both interpretations, but the complete demolition of so much impressive architecture so quickly leaves a void that conspiracy theorists fill with their own narrative. Chapter 6. The Mud Flood Narrative. One of the strangest recurring elements in the Tartaria conspiracy theory is the idea of a global mud flood, a catastrophic event that supposedly buried cities, covered lower floors of buildings, and forced survivors to rebuild at a higher elevation. The evidence cited includes sunken doorways, basement windows at ground level, buildings where the first floor appears to be underground, staircases that lead down to what should be entrances but are now below street level. Conspiracy theorists point to cities across Europe, Asia and North America where these patterns appear. In some cases, entire neighbourhoods seem to have been buried. Streets sit several feet higher than the original. Foundations of buildings. Archaeological excavations reveal layers of sediment that do not match natural accumulation. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. Cities raise their street levels over time. Flooding leads to the deposition of sediment. Buildings are renovated and new roads are built above old ones. This process, called urban stratification, is well documented in places like Rome, London and Istanbul. But conspiracy theorists argue the scale is wrong. They point to examples where the buried layers are too uniform, too extensive, to be explained by gradual accumulation. They cite cities where streets were raised by 10 or 15 feet in a single generation, supposedly due to flooding or fire, but with no clear record of a disaster large enough to require such drastic measures. They also point to photographs from the 1800s showing workers excavating streets, revealing older structures beneath. In some images, fully intact buildings appear underground, complete with windows, doors and foundations that suggest they were designed to be above ground, not below it. The mud flood theory claims this was not gradual urban development. It was a single catastrophic event, a flood or series of floods that buried cities globally within a short time frame. The survivors rebuilt on top of the ruins, creating the layered cities we see today. Is there geological evidence for such an event? Not in the way conspiracy theorists describe. Localized floods, earthquakes and volcanic eruptions have buried cities throughout history. Pompeii, Akrotiri, Helik. But these are isolated incidents, not global phenomena. Yet the pattern of buried buildings is genuinely widespread, and while mainstream explanations account for most cases individually, they do not address the perception of coordinated rebuilding. Why do so many cities seem to have raised their street levels during the same historical period? Why does the timing align so closely with the Industrial Revolution and the disappearance of Tartary from maps? The conspiracy theory thrives on these alignments. It suggests the mud flood was real, caused by some unknown catastrophe, and that the rebuilding effort was part of a larger reset. A deliberate rewriting of history to erase the memory of what came before. Proof? No. But the visual evidence is difficult to dismiss. Sunken windows exist. Buried doorways exist. The explanations for them are plausible, but incomplete. And incompleteness breeds doubt. Examine specific cities. Seattle, for example. In the late 1800s, the city raised its streets by one full story. The official reason: the original streets were prone to flooding. Tides from Puget Sound would regularly inundate the downtown area, creating unsanitary conditions. The solution was to raise the streets, build retaining walls, and fill in the gaps with soil. This explanation is well documented. Engineers kept detailed records. Photographs show the construction process. Today you can tour Seattle's underground, walking through the buried first floors of buildings that are now below street level. But conspiracy theorists ask, why was this necessary? Other coastal cities dealt with flooding without raising entire street grids. Why did Seattle choose such a drastic solution? And why do the buried structures look so well preserved, as if they were not gradually buried by sediment but suddenly covered? Similar patterns appear in other cities. Parts of Edinburgh, Scotland, have buried streets and buildings explained as the result of urban expansion and bridge construction. Parts of Prague have lower levels accessible through basements, explained as medieval construction practices. Parts of Rome have multiple layers, explained by millennia of continuous habitation. Each individual case has a logical explanation, but when viewed collectively, the pattern feels coordinated. Too many cities, too many buried layers, too much similarity in the depth and timing of the burial. The mud flood theory claims this coordination is evidence of a global event. But what event? What could bury cities worldwide in a single generation? Flood geology, popularized by certain religious traditions, suggests a biblical scale deluge. But there is no geological evidence for a global flood in recent history. Ice core data, sediment layers, and tree ring analysis all contradict the idea of a worldwide inundation in the past few thousand years. Volcanic eruptions can bury cities, tsunamis can flood coastlines, earthquakes can cause liquefaction, where soil behaves like a liquid and swallows structures. But these are localized events. They do not explain buried cities on multiple continents. So what does the evidence actually show? Gradual urban development, cities built on top of older cities, streets raised to improve drainage, prevent flooding, and accommodate modern infrastructure. This process happened over centuries in some places, over decades in others. But the gradual explanation does not fully account for the uniformity. Why do so many cities show similar burial depths? Why does the timing cluster around the same period? Why do the buried structures often look intact, as if they were abandoned suddenly rather than gradually buried? Conspiracy theorists do not have a complete answer either. They point to the patterns and suggest catastrophe, but they cannot identify the specific event. The mud flood theory is more of a placeholder, a way of saying something happened that mainstream history does not fully explain. And that is where the theory gains traction, not through proof, but through the accumulation of anomalies. Enough buried buildings, enough raised streets, enough unanswered questions to make people wonder if the official story is incomplete. Chapter 7. The population reset idea. Here is where the conspiracy theory becomes truly speculative, yet strangely compelling. It proposes that the 19th century was not merely a period of rapid industrialization and nation building. It was a reset, a deliberate reorganization of global society following a catastrophic collapse. The timeline they cite includes wars that redrew borders across Europe and Asia, the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, conflicts in Central Asia during the Great Game, each war conveniently reshaping territories that once fell under the vague label of Tartary, pandemics that reduced populations and disrupted continuity, cholera outbreaks, typhus, smallpox epidemics that swept through cities, killing millions and erasing generational knowledge, rapid industrialization that transformed economies almost overnight. Railways appeared across continents, telegraph lines connected distant regions, factories replaced traditional crafts, urban populations exploded, education reforms that standardized history. Public schooling became widespread in the mid to late 1800s, curricula were centralized, textbooks were printed. A single narrative of history was taught to millions of children, replacing localized oral traditions. Separately, these events are well documented and explained. Together, they form a pattern that conspiracy theorists find suspicious. Too many disruptions, too much upheaval, too much change in too short a time. They argue that the wars were not random conflicts, but deliberate efforts to erase old power structures. The pandemics were either natural disasters exploited for control or deliberately engineered to reduce populations. Industrialization was not organic growth, but a planned replacement of old systems with new ones. Education reforms were not enlightenment but indoctrination, designed to make people forget what came before. And in this framework, Tartary was the casualty, the name that represented the old world, the civilization that existed before the reset. Once the reset was complete, the name was no longer needed. It was administratively replaced, and within a generation forgotten. Is there evidence for a coordinated reset? No, not in the way conspiracy theorists describe. History is chaotic, not orchestrated. But the perception of coordination persists because the changes were so profound and so rapid. The world of the 1700s looks nothing like the world of the 1900s. The transformation is staggering, and when transformation happens that quickly, people look for explanations. Some find them in progress and innovation. Others find them in conspiracy and control. Consider the timeline more closely. The Napoleonic Wars ended in the early 1800s. Europe was reshaped. Borders were redrawn. Old monarchies fell. New nations emerged. The Congress of Vienna formalized the new order. Within decades, the Industrial Revolution accelerated. Steam engines replaced water wheels. Factories replaced cottage industries. Railways replaced horse-drawn transport. Cities grew at unprecedented rates, fueled by migration from rural areas. By the mid-1800s, telegraph lines connected continents. News that once took weeks to travel could be transmitted in minutes. Stock markets synchronized. Governments coordinated policies. A global economy emerged. And alongside this, education systems standardized. Before the 1800s, most people learned through oral tradition, apprenticeships, and local communities. History was passed down through stories, not textbooks. Each region had its own narratives, its own heroes, its own understanding of the past. Then, suddenly, public schools appeared. Governments mandated attendance. Curricula were centralized. Children across entire nations learned the same history, the same dates, the same interpretation of events. Within a generation, local traditions faded. The official narrative became the only narrative. Conspiracy theorists see this as deliberate, a way to erase memory of the old world and replace it with a new story. If you control education, you control the past. And if you control the past, you control the future. Mainstream historians explain standardized education as a product of nationalism. Nations needed literate citizens to compete economically and militarily. Industrialization required workers who could read instructions and operate machinery. Public schooling was a practical necessity, not a conspiracy. But the speed is still suspicious. Within 50 years, most of Europe and North America went from scattered local schools to centralized national systems. That is extraordinarily fast, especially for an era without modern communication technology. And the content of the curricula raises questions. History textbooks from the late 1800s present a very specific narrative. Progress, civilization, and the inevitable triumph of industrial society. Old ways are dismissed as primitive, local traditions are ignored, alternative perspectives are excluded. Was this intentional, or simply the natural result of nations trying to build cohesive identities? Both explanations are plausible, but the conspiracy theory suggests something deeper. The education system was designed not just to teach, but to forget. To erase knowledge of what came before the reset and replace it with a sanitized version that justified the new order. If Tartary existed as something more than a vague geographic label, if it represented a prior civilization with its own knowledge and infrastructure, then the education system would need to erase it. And the best way to erase something is not to actively suppress it, but to simply stop mentioning it. Let it fade from memory naturally, replaced by the official story. Within 2 generations, Tartary would be forgotten, and that is exactly what happened. Chapter 8. The Vanishing Word. By the late 1800s, the word Tartary had disappeared from maps. New labels replaced it. The Russian Empire, the Qing Dynasty, Mongolia, Turkestan, Central Asian. Khanates given specific names: Bukhara, Khiva, Kokand. The transition was not violent, it was administrative. Cartographers updated their maps, encyclopedias revised their entries, governments formalised borders through treaties. The word Tartary became obsolete, replaced by more precise terminology. But here is what makes the disappearance unsettling. It was too thorough. Old terms do not vanish completely. They linger in place names, folklore, colloquial speech. We still call Istanbul Constantinople in some contexts. We still refer to Persia even though the country is now Iran. We use Siam and Burma interchangeably with Thailand and Myanmar. But Tartary? Gone. No modern country claims the name. No ethnic group identifies as Tartarian. No language is labelled Tartarian in linguistic studies. The term exists only in old maps and historical texts, treated as a relic of outdated geography. Conspiracy theorists see this as evidence of erasure, not accidental forgetting but deliberate removal. They point to the lack of cultural continuity. No Tartarian descendants. No Tartarian monuments preserved under that name. No Tartarian holidays or traditions remembered. It is as if the name existed in a bubble, acknowledged by outsiders, ignored by insiders, and then erased by everyone. Mainstream historians explain this through the nature of the term itself. Tartary was never a self-identifier. It was imposed by Europeans. The peoples labelled as Tartars did not call themselves that. They had their own names, languages, and identities. When European mapmakers stopped using the term, it disappeared because it had no roots in the cultures it described. This explanation is logical, but it does not explain why the architectural and technological patterns from that era remain so uniform. If Tartary was just a label for disparate peoples, why does their infrastructure look so coordinated? The conspiracy theory suggests the answer, because it was not disparate, it was unified, and, when it fell, the unity was erased from memory, leaving behind only fragments that no longer fit together. Look at what happened to other empire names. The Byzantine Empire is still remembered, even though the people who lived in it called themselves Romans. The Holy Roman Empire is still studied, even though it was famously neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. The Ottoman Empire's name persists in history books, even though the Ottomans themselves use different terms. But Tartary, completely erased. Not just from common usage, but from academic discourse. It appears in historical texts as a footnote, a curiosity, a term that people once used but no longer matters. Why? If it was such a widespread label, used consistently for centuries, why did it vanish so completely? The mainstream answer is that it was never important. It was a placeholder that served its purpose and was discarded when better information became available. The peoples of Central Asia are now understood through their own languages, cultures, and political structures. The term Tartary is no longer needed. But conspiracy theorists ask, if it was never important, why was it used so consistently? Why did multiple cartographers, working independently, all agree on the boundaries? Why did travellers write about Tartary as if it were a real, recognisable region? And why, when the name disappeared, did no one protest? No cultural group claimed ownership of the term. No nation argued that they were the true heirs of Tartary. It simply vanished, as if by agreement. This is where the reset theory gains its strongest foothold. If there was a deliberate effort to erase Tartary from history, the easiest way would be to stop using the name, update the maps, revise the textbooks, teach a new generation that Tartary never existed as anything meaningful. Within a few decades, the name would be forgotten, and that is exactly what happened. By the early 1900s, Tartary had disappeared from public consciousness. Maps no longer showed it. Encyclopedias barely mentioned it. And the peoples who once lived in the region called themselves Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Mongols, Turkmen, never Tartarians. The erasure was so complete that most people today have never heard the term. Even those with an interest in history, even those who have studied the Mongol Empire or the Silk Road, often do not know that Tartary once covered their maps. That level of forgetting is unusual, and it is precisely what fuels the conspiracy theory. Because if something can be erased that thoroughly, what else has been erased? What other names, what other civilizations have been administratively removed from history? The conspiracy theory does not claim to have all the answers. It simply points to the absence and asks, why? Chapter 9. Why evidence feels fragmented. The Tartaria conspiracy theory does not rest on a single smoking gun. It rests on accumulation, maps, architecture, timelines, terminology. Each piece of evidence is individually explainable. Together they form a pattern that feels incomplete. This is the strength and weakness of the theory. It cannot be easily disproven because it does not make a single falsifiable claim. Instead, it asks questions. Why do old maps agree on boundaries that mainstream history says never existed? Why does architecture from the 1800s look older than it should? Why do star forts appear globally with identical designs? Why were the World's Fairs demolished so quickly? Why are so many buildings sunken below modern street level? Why did the word Tartary disappear so completely? Individually, these questions have answers, but the answers feel incomplete. They explain the what, but not always the why. They account for individual cases, but not the overall pattern. And patterns, even without proof, shape belief. This is how conspiracy theories thrive in the modern age, not through fabricated evidence, but through the selective presentation of real anomalies, real maps, real buildings, real timelines that do not quite align. The internet amplifies this process by allowing people to find and share these anomalies faster than context can be provided. The result is a theory that feels plausible not because it is true, but because it is unresolved. And unresolved questions, in the absence of satisfying answers, become fertile ground for speculation. Consider how the evidence is presented. Conspiracy theorists compile photographs of sunken buildings, maps showing Tartary, images of star forts, and timelines of the World's Fairs. They arrange this evidence in a way that highlights the patterns and downplays the context. A photograph of a sunken doorway is presented without mentioning that the city is built on a river delta where flooding is common. A map showing Tartary is presented without explaining that European cartographers used vague labels for regions they had not fully explored. An image of a star fort is presented without acknowledging that military engineering is a well-documented field with clear lines of knowledge transmission. Each piece of evidence, in isolation, looks suspicious. But when context is provided, most of the suspicion evaporates. Yet the conspiracy theory persists because the context does not eliminate all doubt. Yes, cities flood and raise their streets. But why did so many do it during the same period? Yes, cartographers used vague labels. But why did the label Tartary disappear so completely? Yes, military engineering spreads through shared knowledge. But why is the uniformity so precise? The questions remain, even after the context is provided, and those lingering questions are what keep the theory alive. Mainstream historians could do more to address these questions directly. Instead of dismissing Tartaria as nonsense, they could acknowledge the patterns and explain them thoroughly. They could produce comprehensive studies of urban stratification, showing exactly how and why cities raised their streets. They could trace the spread of star fort designs through historical documents, demonstrating how the knowledge travelled. They could examine the World's Fairs in detail, explaining the construction timelines and the reasons for demolition. Some historians have done this work, but it is scattered across academic journals and specialised books, inaccessible to most people. The conspiracy theory, by contrast, is easily accessible online, presented in videos, forums and articles that require no specialised knowledge to understand. This creates an imbalance. The conspiracy theory is compelling, visual and emotionally resonant. The academic rebuttals are thorough but dry, technical and difficult to access. For most people, the conspiracy theory wins by default, not because it is true, but because it is easier to engage with. And this highlights a deeper problem. Mainstream history often assumes that the evidence speaks for itself, but evidence does not speak. It must be interpreted, explained, and contextualized. And if historians do not do that work in accessible ways, alternative interpretations will fill the void. The Tartaria conspiracy theory is a symptom of this void. It points to real patterns, real anomalies, real unanswered questions. The answers exist, but they are not being communicated effectively. And so the questions persist, and the theory grows. Chapter 10. The Modern Revival. The Tartaria conspiracy theory gained traction in the 21st century, fueled by online communities and image-sharing platforms. People began posting photographs of old maps, architectural anomalies, and buried buildings. Each post attracted more attention, more questions, more contributors. What started as a fringe idea became a movement. Channels dedicated to exploring lost civilizations began covering Tartaria. Documentaries were produced. Debates erupted between skeptics and believers. The theory spread across languages and continents, appealing to anyone who felt mainstream history was incomplete. Why did it resonate so strongly? Partly because it taps into a broader sense of distrust. Trust in institutions, trust in official narratives, trust in the idea that we know our own history. In an era where information is abundant but context is scarce, people gravitate toward explanations that feel hidden, suppressed, or forgotten. Tartaria offers that feeling. It is not a theory about aliens or ancient astronauts. It is a theory about human civilization, about empires that rose and fell, about knowledge that was lost or deliberately erased. It feels grounded enough to be plausible, speculative enough to be exciting, and it appeals to a specific kind of curiosity, the desire to believe that there is more to the world than we have been told, that the past is stranger, grander, and more mysterious than the sanitized versions taught in schools. Is Tartaria real? Did a vast empire exist and then vanish without a trace? The evidence does not support that claim, but the evidence does support the idea that something about the 19th century feels incomplete. The speed of change, uniformity of architecture, the disappearance of terminology, the alignment of wars, pandemics, and industrialization. Mainstream history explains all of this through progress, innovation, and imperialism. Conspiracy theorists explain it through reset, erasure, and control. Both narratives fit the evidence, neither is complete. The modern revival of Tartaria is interesting for another reason. It demonstrates how quickly ideas can spread in the digital age. A theory that might have remained obscure a few decades ago can now reach millions of people within months. Videos explaining Tartaria rack up hundreds of thousands of views. Forums dedicated to the topic have tens of thousands of members. The theory has been translated into dozens of languages, discussed on every continent. This rapid spread has advantages and disadvantages. On one hand, it allows people to share information and collaborate on research in ways that were impossible before the internet. On the other hand, it allows misinformation to spread just as quickly, without the filters that traditional media once provided. Tartaria exists in this ambiguous space. It is not entirely fabricated. The maps are real, the buildings are real, the patterns are real, but the interpretation is speculative, often leaping to conclusions that the evidence does not fully support. And yet, the theory has value, not because it is true, but because it forces people to ask questions, to look at old maps and wonder why they were drawn that way, to examine buildings and consider how they were constructed. to think critically about the timelines and narratives they have been taught. In that sense, Tartaria is less a conspiracy theory and more a provocation, a challenge to the idea that history is settled, that we know everything worth knowing about the past. It reminds us that there are gaps in our knowledge, anomalies in the record, patterns that do not quite fit. Whether those gaps point to a lost empire or simply to incomplete research is another question, but the gaps exist, and they deserve attention. Epilogue. Empire or illusion. Tartaria may not have been an empire. It may have been exactly what mainstream historians say, a vague European label for peoples they did not fully understand, a placeholder on maps, waiting to be replaced by better information. But something about its disappearance unsettles people, not because the explanation is wrong, but because it feels insufficient. Empires leave scars. They leave monuments, languages, descendants, traditions. They leave something. Tartary left maps, and then it left nothing. Maybe that is because it was never unified. Maybe the name was always a fiction, a convenience, a misunderstanding that faded when knowledge improved. Maybe the architectural patterns, the buried buildings, the star forts, the world's fairs, maybe all of it is coincidence, or misinterpretation, or the natural result of rapid change in a chaotic century. Or maybe history does not forget things by accident. Maybe it forgets them when they no longer fit the story being told. When the narrative needs to move forward, and the past becomes inconvenient, uncomfortable, or contradictory. Maybe Tartaria was never an empire at all. Maybe it was just a name, but names have power, and when a name disappears we should ask why, not to prove a conspiracy but to understand what we have lost, or what we were never meant to remember. The maps exist, the buildings exist, the questions exist, the answers remain incomplete, and maybe that is the real mystery. Not what Tartaria was, but why we stopped asking. In the end, the Tartaria conspiracy theory is less about proving a lost empire, and more about confronting the limits of historical knowledge. We assume that the past is well documented, that major events are recorded, that empires do not simply vanish, but the historical record is full of gaps, errors, and omissions. Civilizations have risen and fallen without leaving clear traces. Knowledge has been lost, sometimes deliberately, sometimes through neglect. Tartaria reminds us of this fragility. Whether it was an empire or an illusion, its disappearance from maps and memory demonstrates how quickly names can be forgotten, how thoroughly narratives can be rewritten, and how easily doubt can take root when explanations feel incomplete. The theory will likely persist, not because it can be proven, but because it cannot be fully disproven. The patterns are real, the anomalies are real, the questions are real. And as long as those questions remain unanswered, people will continue to wonder. What was Tartaria? Where did it go? And what else have we forgotten? These are not comfortable questions. They challenge the certainty with which we view the past. They suggest that history is less settled than we would like to believe, and they remind us that the line between fact and interpretation is often thinner than we assume. So whether Tartaria was an empire or an illusion, whether it was erased or simply outgrown, the theory serves a purpose. It makes us look closer at the evidence. It makes us question the narratives we accept without scrutiny. And it makes us realise that the past is not as knowable as we pretend. That, perhaps, is the real lesson of Tartaria. Not that a lost empire existed, but that our understanding of history is always incomplete, always subject to revision, always dependent on which questions we choose to ask. And some questions, once asked, can never be fully answered. They linger, they haunt. They remind us that the world is stranger and more complex than any single narrative can capture. Tartaria exists now as a question, a gap in the historical record, a pattern that does not quite fit, and maybe that is all it ever was. Reminder that no matter how much we think we know, there is always more beneath the surface, always another layer waiting to be uncovered, or waiting to remain buried, depending on who is writing the story. What if the deadliest attack on a United States naval vessel since World War II wasn't an accident at all? What if 34 Americans died not in confusion, but as collateral damage in a weapons test so secret that the US government spent 50 years burying the truth beneath layers of classified silence? Before we dive into this story, I want to give a massive thank you to Mr. Hill420 and so many others who suggested this topic. Your curiosity drives these investigations, and I'm grateful for it. If you have ideas for future videos, drop them in the comments below. Now let's explore what really happened on June 8th, 1967 in the Eastern Mediterranean, and why the echoes of that day still reverberate through classified channels today. Act 1. The Silence Before the Storm. June 8th, 1967, 1400 local time. Eastern Mediterranean, 25 nautical miles off the Sinai coast. The USS Liberty cut through calm waters under a flawless Mediterranean sky. At 455 feet long and displacing over 10,000 tons, the modified Victory-class cargo ship looked unremarkable, a rusting relic of World War II pressed back into service. But appearances deceived. Bristling with antennas, microwave dishes, and SIGINT collection arrays, Liberty was the NSA's floating ear in the Middle East, listening to a region on the brink of tearing itself apart. The Six-Day War had erupted 4 days earlier. Regional powers clashed across ancient battlefields, while Cold War superpowers watched nervously from the sidelines. The Soviet Mediterranean squadron lurked just over the horizon. American forces maintained a tense neutrality, and through it all, Liberty listened. Below decks, in the cramped research spaces that reeked of coffee, cigarette smoke and hot electronics, 45 cryptologic technicians from the Naval Security Group worked in shifts. They monitored everything: military communications, diplomatic channels, encrypted transmissions from ships and aircraft across the region. Every signal, every transmission, every whispered order flowed through their receivers and into the classified intelligence pipeline feeding Fort Meade, Maryland. Petty Officer First Class Mark Reynolds had been on station for 6 hours straight. At 24 years old, he possessed the kind of focused intensity that made him perfect for signals intelligence work, able to distinguish signal from noise in the chaotic electromagnetic spectrum of a war zone. His station monitored multiple frequencies, including those reserved for American military operations. At 14:13, Reynolds's headphones crackled with a transmission that made him straighten in his chair. The signal came through on a frequency that shouldn't have been active, a restricted channel reserved for classified naval operations. The encryption pattern was sophisticated, military grade, but something felt wrong. Reynolds keyed his recorder and leaned closer. "Shadow 7 to Cyan Control," the voice said in clear English with an American accent. "Phase 2 parameters confirmed. Frequency modulation holding at 7.83 Hz. Standing by for sequence initiation." Reynolds felt his pulse quicken. Cyan Control? That designation didn't appear in any briefing material, and that frequency, 7.83 Hz, meant nothing to him in military terms. He scribbled notes frantically. A second voice responded, also American, clipped and efficient. "Cyan Control confirms. Maintain visual contact with target vessel until phase termination. Weather conditions optimal. Execute on my mark." "Target vessel?" Reynolds' hand moved to the intercom switch to alert the communications officer, but he hesitated. Intercepting US military communications wasn't unusual. The NSA gathered signals from American forces routinely for training and verification purposes. But this felt different. That frequency, the deliberate emphasis on visual contact, the designation Cyan. He never got the chance to report it. At 14:14, the radar operator 2 compartments forward shouted into the circuit. "Multiple surface contacts bearing 090, range 30 miles and closing. Fast movers. Confirmed aircraft." On the bridge, Commander William McGonigal lowered his binoculars and squinted into the eastern sky. He'd been tracking distant aircraft for the past 20 minutes, reconnaissance flights he'd assumed. The Liberty flew an American flag the size of a garage door. The hull number was clearly visible. In these conditions, with visibility exceeding 10 miles and zero wind, there was no possibility of confusion. At 14:15, 3 unidentified jet fighters dropped from high altitude and screamed toward the Liberty at 500 knots. The first indication of hostile intent came not from weapons but from proximity. The aircraft circled the ship 3 times, low enough that sailors on deck could see them clearly. Some waved, assuming they were friendly forces. A few took photographs. Then the fighters banked hard and lined up for attack runs. What happened next would be disputed for decades, analysed frame by frame, dissected in naval courts and congressional hearings. But for the men aboard Liberty, the truth was simple and absolute. They were being attacked by unidentified forces. The first cannon rounds shredded the forward antennas at 14:16. Radar dishes exploded in sparks. Communications arrays tumbled into the sea. The aircraft made multiple passes, their weapons stitching lines of destruction across the deck and superstructure. Commander McGonagall stood on the bridge wing, fully exposed, shouting orders as shrapnel tore through steel around him. He wouldn't leave his post, wouldn't abandon the con even as the windows exploded inward and instrument panels sparked and died. Below decks, Reynolds clutched his headphones as the compartment shook. The overhead lights flickered. Then, through the static and interference, he heard it again. That American voice. Calm and analytical. Sine wave sequence maintaining coherence. Phase 2 progressing nominally. His recorder was still running. At 14:24, the fighters broke off. For 8 minutes, an eerie quiet descended. Damage control teams scrambled topside. The wounded screamed for corpsmen. Fires burned in 3 compartments. Then sonar picked up high-speed screws. 3 unidentified torpedo boats emerged from the coastal haze, their decks crowded with sailors manning deck guns. They opened fire immediately, 40mm and 20mm rounds hammering the Liberty's hull, shredding life rafts, killing sailors who'd made it to the deck. At 14:31, one of the boats fired a torpedo. The torpedo struck the Liberty on the starboard side, below the waterline, directly beneath the signal's intelligence spaces. The explosion ripped through the research compartments like a fist through tissue paper. Bulkheads buckled. Seawater rushed in. 25 men died instantly, crushed or drowned in the flooding. Mark Reynolds survived only because he'd been thrown against a bulkhead by the blast. Unconscious, bleeding, half submerged in rising water, he clutched his recorder as shipmates dragged him through the darkness toward the ladders. The attack continued for another 40 minutes. By the time the attacking forces withdrew at 15:30, Liberty was a floating wreck. 34 men were dead. 171 were wounded. The ship listed heavily to starboard, fires still burning, taking on water. But she didn't sink, and below decks, in the flooded research spaces, a magnetic tape labelled Sine Wave Intercept 6867 floated in the darkness, sealed inside Reynolds' waterproof recorder bag. Act 2. The Inquiry. September the 1967. Naval Court of Inquiry. Malta. The official inquiry convened 3 months after the attack, far from American shores and prying media. Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd Jr. presided, a stern-faced officer with 30 years of service and a reputation for thorough investigation. The court's mandate was clear: determine what happened, who was responsible, and whether Liberty's crew bore any fault for their own casualties. From the beginning, something felt wrong. Witnesses testified to crystal-clear weather, a clearly marked American flag, the ship's hull number visible for miles. They described the methodical nature of the assault, not frenzied combat, but deliberate targeting of antennas and communications equipment. Some testified to seeing torpedo boats machine-gunning life rafts. The official explanation came swiftly: a case of mistaken identity during a chaotic regional conflict. Foreign forces had confused Liberty for an enemy vessel. Tragic but understandable in the fog of war, sincere apologies, compensation offered. The American government accepted this explanation within hours of the attack, but the evidence suggested otherwise. On the 3rd day of testimony, Mark Reynolds took the stand. His face was still mottled with burn scars, his left hand bandaged. He walked with a pronounced limp. The court recorder noted that he seemed nervous, kept glancing at the door, Admiral Kidd asked him to describe his duties on June 8th. Reynolds began with routine details, his station, his assignment, the frequencies he monitored. Then he paused. "Sir, I need to submit evidence," Reynolds said quietly. "What sort of evidence, Petty Officer?" "An audio recording. I made it during the attack. It contains transmissions I intercepted on a secure frequency. American voices coordinating the attack sequence." The courtroom went silent. Kidd leaned forward. "You recorded American personnel coordinating an attack on an American vessel." "I don't know what I recorded, sir. But the voices were American. They used a designation I'd never heard before, Cyan Wave. They spoke about phase sequences, frequency modulation, maintaining visual contact with the target vessel." Reynolds produced a reel-to-reel tape from a canvas bag, labelled in his own handwriting, "Cyan Wave Intercept 6867. A Navy lawyer immediately objected. The tape hadn't been submitted through proper evidence channels. Its chain of custody was questionable. Reynolds himself admitted he'd kept it hidden for 3 months, afraid of what might happen if he turned it over. Admiral Kidd examined the tape without playing it. "This will be entered into evidence and reviewed by appropriate authorities. Petty Officer Reynolds, you are to discuss this with no one outside this court. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." The tape was logged as Evidence Item 47B, placed in a sealed envelope and transferred to a secure evidence locker. It vanished. No official record of the tape exists in the declassified inquiry documents. Reynolds' testimony about it was redacted from the public version of the proceedings. When he tried to follow up weeks later, he was told the tape had been misplaced during transfer to NSA custody for technical analysis. 3 months later, Reynolds received orders to a submarine tender in the Pacific. His security clearance was administratively reduced. His service record noted, "Not recommended for cryptologic assignments." He never spoke publicly about Liberty or Cyan Wave again. Fort Meade, Maryland, November 1967. NASA headquarters. Linda Baker had worked for the National Security Agency for 11 years, analysing signals intelligence from every corner of the globe. At 36, she was one of the senior analysts in the Naval SIGINT Division, trusted with the most sensitive intercepts. In November 1967, she was tasked with reviewing backup recordings from the Liberty attack, part of the NSA's internal assessment of what went wrong with their intelligence collection that day. The work was tedious. Hours of radio chatter, static, routine military communications. But Baker had a gift for pattern recognition, for seeing anomalies others missed. On her 4th day reviewing the backups, she noticed something odd. At several points during the attack, 1414, 1422, 1429 and 1441, her spectrum analysis showed unusual electromagnetic activity. Brief bursts of extremely low-frequency interference, lasting only seconds but powerful enough to partially distort other signals. She ran the frequencies through analysis software, 7.83 Hz, repeating. Baker frowned. That frequency was known as the Schumann resonance, the natural electromagnetic frequency of the Earth's ionosphere, created by lightning discharges globally. It had nothing to do with military communications. Radio equipment didn't operate at that frequency. It was too low, too weak, essentially background noise of the planet itself. So why did it appear in military signal intercepts at the exact moments of Liberty's attack phases? She wrote a technical memo and submitted it through channels. The response came back 3 days later. Technical artifact. Atmospheric interference. No intelligence value. But Baker wasn't satisfied. She cross-referenced the timing against the attack timeline reconstructed from survivor testimony. The frequency spikes occurred precisely when aircraft began their runs, when the torpedo boats opened fire, when the torpedo was launched. Not random atmospheric interference, coordinated. She tried to dig deeper, requesting access to Liberty's raw intercept logs, the unprocessed recordings captured by the ship's equipment. Her request was denied. Those materials were classified at a level above your current access. Linda Baker had top-secret clearance. What could be above that? She tried a different approach. Using her access to the NSA's internal file system, she searched for any mention of Cyan Wave. One result appeared, a project file from 1965, heavily redacted, sponsored jointly by DARPA and the Office of Naval Intelligence. The project number was CW-12/7. The file contained only 3 pages. Most of it was blacked out, but one paragraph remained visible. Project Cyan Wave explores applications of extremely low-frequency electromagnetic modulation for tactical radar signature manipulation. Testing requires controlled combat environment with multiple sensor platforms. Operational security classification, Cosmic Top Secret. Cosmic Top Secret was a NATO designation, higher than anything in the standard US classification system. Baker printed the page, then immediately regretted it. She looked around her cubicle, suddenly paranoid. This wasn't just classified. This was the kind of material people's careers ended over. She folded the page into her purse and deleted her search history. That night she typed a summary of her findings and mailed it to herself at her home address. If something happened to her at work, if these files disappeared, or she was suddenly reassigned, at least she'd have proof she'd seen them. 2 weeks later, her supervisor called her into a meeting. NSA Security was conducting a routine review of database access logs. Nothing to worry about, just standard procedure. They asked her about her search for Cyan Wave. Baker kept her face neutral. I came across the term in a Liberty Intercept backup and wanted to understand the context. And did you? No, the file was mostly redacted. The security officer smiled. Good. That means the classification system is working. In the future, if you encounter project names you don't recognize, please submit an information request through proper channels rather than searching directly. Understood. Understood. She wasn't reassigned. Her clearance wasn't revoked, but the message was clear. Some doors stay closed. Linda Baker returned to her routine work, analysing intercepts from Vietnam and the Soviet Union. She never searched for Cyan Wave again, but she kept that printed page hidden in a safety deposit box. Act 3. The Declassified Ghost. 2003 to 2017. The Long Thaw. In the years following the Cold War's end, the intelligence community slowly began declassifying historical materials under the Freedom of Information Act. Thousands of pages from the 1960s and 70s filtered into public archives, NSA operational summaries, CIA memoranda, military intelligence assessments. The USS Liberty attack, still controversial decades later, attracted particular attention from researchers and conspiracy theorists. Survivors had formed advocacy groups. Journalists had written books questioning the official mistaken identity narrative. The government maintained its story quietly but firmly. In 2003, the NSA released the first batch of Liberty-related intercepts, heavily redacted but enough to confirm that the agency had been monitoring communications in real time during the attack. Linda Baker, now retired and 72 years old, read about the release in the Washington Post. She'd thought about that day in 1967 occasionally over the decades, wondered what had really happened to that tape, whether anyone else had noticed those strange frequency spikes. She requested her old security clearance be reactivated, a privilege available to retired intelligence personnel for consulting work. The approval took 6 months, but eventually she received her credentials and access to the NSA's historical archives in College Park, Maryland. She spent 3 weeks reading through the declassified Liberty materials. Most of it she'd seen before, the attack timeline, intercept summaries, damage reports. But then she noticed something. In the official NSA summary from June 1967, the page numbers jumped. Page 13 was followed by page 15. Page 14 was missing. Baker checked the original classification log. Page 14 had been titled Classified Naval Operations, Coordination with Advanced Research Projects. That page remained classified. She submitted a FOIA request for page 14 specifically. The response took 2 years. Denied. Material still classified in the interest of national security. But Baker had spent 11 years at NSA. She knew how to read around redactions, how to find information in metadata and file structures. She started pulling every document from 1967 that referenced classified naval operations in the Mediterranean. Most were routine: submarine deployments, carrier group movements, Soviet naval tracking operations. Then she found it. A budget document from early 1967, listing project expenditures for the Office of Naval Research. Buried in a table of appropriations, CW 12/7, Field Test Coordination, $8.7 million. The date range, May 15th, 1967 to June 30th, 1967, exactly covering the period of the Six-Day War. Baker's hands trembled as she photographed the page with her phone. After 50 years, proof that sine wave wasn't a phantom, wasn't something she'd imagined. She kept digging. Over the next 2 years, she found fragments. A 1968 memo from DARPA referencing successful field demonstration of phase cancellation radar spoofing technology in operational environment. A 1970 patent application, US Patent 5,159,703, for electromagnetic signature modulation device, listing 3 inventors from Raytheon Advanced Systems and the Naval Research Laboratory. A 1982 intelligence report on Soviet radar capabilities noting, Soviet naval defense systems exhibit vulnerability to low-frequency phase modulation, similar to effects observed during classified operations in 1967. The pattern was unmistakable. Sine wave had been real, it had been tested, and Liberty had been there when it happened. But why attack the ship? If Liberty was collecting data for the NSA, if this was an American military operation, why would they attack their own intelligence vessel? Unless Liberty wasn't supposed to be there, unless the ship's presence was unauthorized, and its advanced listening equipment threatened to record something that was never meant to be recorded. Unless Liberty itself was the target, not by foreign forces, but by elements within the US military, conducting a weapons test that required complete secrecy. 2017. The breakthrough. In March 2017, the NSA released another batch of Liberty documents, the most extensive yet, over 3,000 pages. Researchers around the world began combing through them. Linda Baker, now 86 and fighting lung cancer, received a call from James Wilson, a historian at the Naval War College who'd been studying Liberty for 2 decades. "Linda, I found something," Wilson said, "in the intercept logs. There's a reference to your name." "What kind of reference?" "A memo from December 1967. Subject: Analyst concerns regarding low-frequency interference in Liberty intercepts. It says you submitted a technical report about unusual electromagnetic readings during the attack. Did you?" "Yes. They told me it was atmospheric interference. The memo says your analysis was forwarded to something called the Advanced Concepts Group for evaluation. That group reported directly to the NSA director. Whatever you found, Linda, it went to the very top." Baker felt a chill. "What else does it say?" "That your findings were consistent with expected technical signatures of active countermeasure systems." "Linda, they knew. They knew what you'd found, and they buried it." "Can you send me that memo?" "Already did. Check your email." Baker opened her laptop with shaking hands. The memo appeared on screen, typed on NSA letterhead, signed by an assistant director whose name had been redacted. One sentence leaped out at her. Analyst Baker's detection of 7.83 Hz modulation during combat operations confirmed successful field implementation of Project CW 12/7 parameters. Successful field implementation? They'd tested their radar spoofing technology using Liberty as an unwitting target, used it to make the ship appear and disappear on radar screens, creating confusion, creating plausible deniability for an attack that would destroy the evidence of the test itself. 34 Americans had died to protect a secret weapons program. But who had conducted the actual attack? Foreign forces used as unwitting proxies, unmarked US aircraft and vessels, mercenaries hired through intelligence cutouts. The memo didn't say. Perhaps that was the final layer of the secret, ensuring that even if the truth about sine wave emerged, no one could definitively prove who had pulled the triggers. Baker stared at the screen for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called someone she thought she'd never contact again. Act 4. The recording. 2025, 8 years later. Washington, D.C. Evan Carter was 34 years old and tired of writing about budget hearings and committee appointments, for the Washington political blog that employed him. He'd gone into journalism to expose corruption, to hold power accountable. Instead, he spent his days rewriting press releases and attending briefings where nobody said anything real. Then a package arrived at his office with no return address, postmarked from Newport News, Virginia, home to the largest naval shipyard on the East Coast. Inside was a reel-to-reel tape in a waterproof bag, labelled in faded ink, Cyan Wave Intercept 6867. Also inside, a typed note on yellowed paper. "Mr. Carter, you don't know me, but I know your work. This recording was made aboard USS Liberty during the attack on June 8th, 1967. I was told to destroy it. I couldn't. Before I die, someone should hear what really happened that day. Listen carefully. Look for Cyan Wave. They're still using it. MR." Carter's first instinct was to throw it away. Anonymous packages, conspiracy theories about 50-year-old incidents. This was exactly the kind of rabbit hole that destroyed journalists' credibility. But curiosity won. He took the tape to an audio restoration specialist in Baltimore who digitized it for $200 and didn't ask questions. That night, Carter sat in his apartment with noise-cancelling headphones and pressed play. For the first minute, nothing but static and distant voices. Then clearer, military radio traffic, terse commands, acknowledgements. Someone was intercepting operational communications in real time. At timestamp 1413, an American voice cut through. "Shadow 7 to Cyan Control. Phase 2 parameters confirmed. Frequency modulation holding at 7.83 Hz. Standing by for sequence initiation." Carter stopped the playback, rewound it, listened again. American voice, American military radio protocol, speaking about a phase sequence moments before the attack began. He kept listening. At 1416, the sound changed. Loud cracks, metallic impacts, screaming. The attack had begun. Through the chaos, another American voice, older, strained. "Cyan Control, this is Liberty Actual. We are under fire. We are a United States vessel. Cease fire! Cease fire!" That voice was familiar. Carter paused the recording and pulled up archival footage of Liberty survivors on YouTube. Commander William McGonigal, the ship's captain, giving testimony before Congress in 1982, the same voice. But according to all historical accounts, McGonigal had been on the bridge, fully exposed, with no radio equipment. He'd communicated through the bridge circuit, which had been destroyed in the first minutes of the attack, so how was he on this recording, speaking on a secure frequency that shouldn't have existed? Carter listened to the entire 75 minutes. The attack unfolded in real time. The aircraft, the torpedo boats, the screams, the chaos. And beneath it all, periodically cutting through, those calm American voices. Maintain visual lock, phase progression nominal, data collection continuing. At timestamp 1528, just before the attacking forces withdrew, one final transmission. Cyan Control to all stations, phase termination in 60 seconds, secure all data collection equipment. Shadow 7, confirm recording status. Recording complete, 73 minutes of continuous sensor data. Phase cancellation maintained throughout engagement. Excellent. Return to station. Operation Cyan Wave is concluded. Then silence. Carter sat in the darkness of his apartment, heart pounding. He just listened to evidence of a classified US military operation targeting one of its own ships. Not mistaken identity, not accidental friendly fire, a test. He needed verification. He needed someone who'd understand the technical implications, someone with intelligence community experience. He thought about that note's warning. They're still using it. Using what? Radar spoofing technology? This Cyan Wave system? Carter spent the next week researching. He found Linda Baker's name in declassified NSA documents about Liberty, one of the analysts who'd reviewed the intercepts. She'd be in her 90s now if she was still alive. A record search found her in Arlington, Virginia, age 94, still alive. He called her number. She answered on the fourth ring. "Mrs. Baker, my name is Evan Carter. I'm a journalist in Washington. I have a recording I think you need to hear." "What kind of recording?" "It's labelled Cyan Wave Intercept, from June 8th, 1967. The line went silent for so long Carter thought she'd hung up. "Come to my house tomorrow," Baker said finally. "Come alone, bring the recording." Arlington, Virginia, the next day. Linda Baker's home was a small ranch house in a quiet neighbourhood, the yard immaculately maintained, American flag on the porch. Carter knocked, and she answered immediately, a tiny woman with sharp eyes and hands gnarled by arthritis. "Mr. Carter, come in." Her living room was neat, military precise, walls covered with framed photographs. A younger Baker in the 1960s professional attire, posed with colleagues outside Fort Meade. Citations for distinguished service. A shadow box with medals. Carter set up his laptop and played the recording. Baker listened with her eyes closed, hands folded in her lap. When McGonagall's voice came through, "Scion Control, this is Liberty Actual," her eyes opened sharply. "That's not possible," she whispered. Carter paused the playback. "What's not possible?" "That voice. That's Commander McGonagall. I heard his testimony before Congress. But he couldn't have been transmitting on that frequency. The bridge communications were destroyed. Unless... Unless what?" Baker stood slowly and walked to a bookshelf. She removed a thick photo album and opened it, revealing not photographs but papers, decades-old documents, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. "I kept copies," she said. "Things I wasn't supposed to keep. Things I thought might matter someday." She showed Carter the 1967 memo referencing the 7.83 Hz frequency spikes, the budget document listing sine wave funding, the patent application for electromagnetic signature modulation. It was a test, Baker said. They were testing radar spoofing technology, making ships appear and disappear on radar screens by manipulating extremely low-frequency electromagnetic fields. Liberty's sensors were sophisticated enough to detect it, to record it, so they had to eliminate the evidence. By attacking their own ship, by creating a plausible cover story, a regional conflict, mistaken identity, fog of war. The attackers, whoever they actually were, could claim confusion. The US government accepts the explanation to protect its weapons program. 34 dead sailors become classified collateral damage. Carter felt sick. But the recording, McGonagall's voice. How? Two possibilities, Baker said. Either there were two separate communication streams, one real, one for the test control, or the recording itself is partially fabricated. Someone created a comprehensive audio record of the operation for documentation purposes, splicing together real combat recordings with test control transmissions. Who would do that? The NSA, DARPA, the Office of Naval Intelligence. Any agency running a black budget program that needs to document results without creating discoverable evidence. Carter thought about the anonymous note. They're still using it. "Mrs. Baker, if this technology existed in 1967, what would it look like now? 58 years of development?" Baker smiled grimly. "Stealth technology, active radar cancellation, electronic warfare systems that can make fighter jets invisible, ships disappear, missiles appear where they aren't. Every major military on Earth now uses descendants of what they tested that day. Can you prove any of this? Not in a way that would hold up in court, not in a way that would force declassification. The people who ordered it are dead. The paper trail is fragments and redactions. All we have are patterns and implications." Carter gestured at his laptop. "We have this recording." "Do we? Where did it come from? Who sent it? Could be authentic. Could be disinformation designed to surface and be debunked, discrediting everyone who takes it seriously. That's how intelligence agencies protect secrets, not by hiding them, but by surrounding them with so much noise that the truth becomes indistinguishable from paranoia." They sat in silence. "What do I do with this?" Carter asked finally. "What every journalist does. You tell the story. You let people decide what they believe. But understand, if you publish this, you'll be attacked, called a conspiracy theorist. Your credibility will be questioned. Sources will dry up. And if the recording is real, if there really are people still using this technology, they won't be happy that you've exposed it." Carter looked at the old woman across from him, someone who'd kept these secrets for nearly 60 years, waiting for the right moment. "Why didn't you go public, back in 1967 or any time since?" "Because I wasn't brave enough," Baker said simply, "and because I wasn't sure it would matter. The world had moved on. The technology proliferated. What would exposing it accomplish except my own destruction? Then why help me now? Because I'm 94 years old and dying. Because 34 sailors deserve better than being written off as collateral damage in a mistaken identity incident. And because someone sent you that recording for a reason, maybe it's time for the truth. Act 5. The Modern Implication. 3 months later. Evan Carter published his story in The Atlantic. Operation Taiyan Wave. New evidence suggests USS Liberty attack was classified US weapons test. The response was immediate and polarised. Survivors of the Liberty attack and their families praised the article. Military historians debated its implications. Intelligence community veterans appeared on news programmes to denounce it as baseless speculation. The Pentagon declined to comment. Carter received death threats. He also received calls from 3 former NSA analysts who claimed they'd seen similar frequency anomalies in other classified operations from the Cold War era. None would go on record. 2 weeks after publication, Carter received a formal letter from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence requesting he turn over the original recording for authentication analysis. He declined through his lawyer, citing source protection. The story faded from the news cycle after a month. Some things are too old, too buried, too protected by institutional inertia to ever fully surface. But Carter kept digging. He found the patent Linda Baker had mentioned, US Patent 5159703. Method and apparatus for electromagnetic signature modulation. Filed in 1970, granted in 1992. The inventors, Richard Kellerman, Raytheon Advanced Systems, David Morse, DARPA Research Division, and Thomas Chen, Naval Research Laboratory. The patent described using extremely low-frequency electromagnetic pulses to create phase cancellation of radar return signals, making objects invisible to radar detection. Commercial application: stealth technology for military aircraft and naval vessels. The patent cited prior research from 1965 to 1967, but didn't name the project. Carter found academic papers from the 1980s and 90s discussing the Schumann resonance, that's 7.83 Hz frequency, and its potential military applications. Theoretical work on using Earth's natural electromagnetic field as a carrier signal for undetectable communications or radar manipulation. He found a 2003 Defense Advanced Research Project's agency request for proposals. Iron field stabilization, active phase defense systems for next-generation electronic warfare. The technology had never stopped developing. Whatever they tested on Liberty in 1967 had evolved into the cutting edge of modern military technology. The secret had been protected not just to avoid accountability for an attack, but to preserve a strategic advantage that was still relevant today. Arlington National Cemetery, November 2025. On a cold afternoon, 58 years after the attack, the US Navy unveiled a memorial plaque for the USS Liberty at Arlington National Cemetery. A small ceremony, attended by aging survivors, family members, and a handful of Navy officials. Linda Baker attended in a wheelchair, oxygen tank at her side. She watched as a Marine Honor Guard presented the colours, and a Navy chaplain offered prayers for the dead. When the ceremony ended, a man in civilian clothes approached her. Late 50s, grey suit, no identifying credentials. "Mrs. Baker? I'm with the Office of Naval Intelligence, thank you for attending." "Did you know them?" "The men who died?" "No, ma'am. Before my time, but I wanted to thank you personally." "For what?" "For your service. For your discretion over the years. For helping close an old file." Baker looked at him sharply. "I didn't close anything. That journalist's story is still out there." The man smiled. "Stories fade. Conspiracy theories multiply and discredit themselves. What matters is that the institutional memory remains consistent. Tragic accident. Mistaken identity. Fog of war. Some things are better left under the waterline where they belong." He handed her a business card, blank except for a phone number. "If you ever need anything, Mrs. Baker, the Navy takes care of its own." He walked away before she could respond. That night, Baker sat in her living room, too tired to sleep. She thought about Mark Reynolds, whoever he was now, whatever had happened to him. She thought about the men who died on liberty. She thought about all the secrets she'd kept and all the years that had passed. Her computer chimed. Incoming email. The sender address was a random string of characters, no subject line. She opened it. The message contained only 2 lines of text and an audio file attachment. Echo phase reactivated. Frequency 7.83 Hz detected. Eastern Med Array. Baker's hand trembled as she clicked the attachment. A waveform appeared on her screen. Audio data, time-stamped from the earlier that day. She plugged in her headphones and pressed play. At first, nothing. White noise. The hiss of distant ocean monitoring equipment. Then, gradually emerging from the background, a low rhythmic pulse. Steady. Measured. Precisely 7.83 Hz. The same frequency she detected 58 years ago. The pulse continued for 30 seconds, growing slightly louder, more distinct, and beneath it so faint she had to turn the volume to maximum. Something else. Not random noise. Pattern. Structure. Multiple voices overlapped and distorted, speaking in fragments. Phase alignment confirmed. Target lock acquired. Maintain visual until... Cyan control. Baker's breath caught. These weren't recordings from 1967. The audio quality was too clean, too digital. This was new, current, happening right now. She checked the timestamp again. November 15th, 2025, 1413 UTC. The exact same time the Liberty attack had begun, 58 years earlier, 1413 local time in the Eastern Mediterranean. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Someone was running the system again, in the same location, at the same time, either as a test, a demonstration, or an actual operation. The audio file continued playing. The pulse grew stronger, more insistent, until it began to synchronize with something else. A deeper rhythm, slower, familiar. It took her a moment to recognize it. A heartbeat. Human heartbeat rhythm. Approximately 60 beats per minute. The electromagnetic pulse was modulating to match it, as if the technology itself had evolved to interface with biological rhythms, making it harder to distinguish from natural background noise. The sound built, layering upon itself, electromagnetic pulse, human heartbeat, those fragmented voices, all blending into a single resonant frequency that made Baker's chest feel tight, her own heart seeming to synchronize with the rhythm coming through her headphones. At exactly 60 seconds, the audio cut out. Silence. Baker sat frozen, headphones still on, staring at her computer screen. The email had already disappeared from her inbox. She checked her deleted folder, her spam folder. Nothing. As if it had never existed. But the audio file was still on her desktop, and she tried to open it again. The file was corrupted, 0 bytes, unreadable. Someone had sent her evidence of an active operation and then remotely erased it, leaving her with nothing but memory and the knowledge that after 58 years, Cyan Wave wasn't history. It was still operational, still secret, still being used somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean at this very moment. Baker closed her laptop and sat in the darkness of her living room. Outside, a cold November wind rattled the windows. The American flag on her porch snapped and rippled. She thought about those 34 sailors, about Mark Reynolds and his stolen tape, about Commander McGonagall standing on that bridge refusing to abandon his post, even as his ship was destroyed around him. She thought about all the secrets she'd kept, all the years of silence and whether any of it had mattered. Her phone sat on the table beside her. She could call Carter, tell him about the email, the audio, the active signal, but what would that accomplish? Another story that would be denied, debunked, dismissed. Or she could do nothing, let it go, die with her secrets intact, having spent her whole life in the shadows of classified operations. Baker picked up the phone. She dialed Carter's number. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Baker, are you okay? It's almost midnight." "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, "they're running it again. Right now, same location, same time. I just received proof." "Received from who?" "I don't know. Someone who wants me to know, or wants to see what I'll do with the information." "Do you still have the proof?" "No." It erased itself, but I heard it, Evan, that frequency, those voices. It's not historical, it's active, right now. Carter was silent for a moment. What do you want me to do? I want you to keep digging. Keep asking questions. Don't let them bury it for another 58 years. Those men deserve better. The truth deserves better. And you? What will you do? Baker looked at the blank business card from the ONI officer, still sitting on her coffee table. I'm going to make a phone call, she said. I'm going to tell them I know. And then I'm going to sleep better than I have in 58 years. They might... I'm 94 years old and dying of cancer, Evan. What are they going to do? The only power they have over me is silence. And I'm done being silent. She hung up before he could argue. Baker sat for a long time, holding that blank business card, thinking about consequences and courage and the weight of truth. Finally, at 12:47 a.m, she dialed the number. It rang once. A voice answered. Male, neutral, professional. Yes? This is Linda Baker. Someone wanted me to know that sine wave is still active. I'm calling to tell you that I know. I've always known. And now someone else knows too. Silence on the line then. Mrs. Baker, I think you may be confused. Perhaps. I'm not confused. I was there from the beginning. I saw the frequency data. I kept the documents. And tonight I heard the same pulse, live, from the Eastern Mediterranean. You can deny it, classify it, bury it under 50 more years of secrecy, but you can't stop the truth from eventually surfacing. Another pause. When the voice returned, it was colder. The truth, Mrs. Baker, is complicated. National security requires difficult decisions. Sometimes the greater good demands sacrifice. Tell that to the 34 men who died. Their sacrifice advanced American defensive capabilities that have protected thousands of lives since. Would you undo that? I would have found another way. One that didn't require killing our own sailors. There was no other way. And if you truly believed what you're saying, you would have gone public decades ago. But you didn't. Because you understand the necessity of secrets. Baker closed her eyes. He was right. She'd had 58 years to speak. She'd chosen silence. Until now. You're right, she said softly. I should have spoken sooner. But I can end my life having finally told the truth. Sine wave happened. It's still happening. And people deserve to know. No one will believe you without proof. And you have none. Maybe. But I'm not the only one who knows anymore. And eventually secrets always surface. Good night, Mrs. Baker. Thank you for your service. The line went dead. Baker set down the phone and exhaled slowly. Her heart was racing. She felt more alive than she had in years. She'd done it. Finally, after all this time, she'd confronted the people who'd buried the truth for 6 decades. Outside, a car started somewhere on her street. Engine noise, headlights briefly washing across her windows, then darkness again. If they were watching, let them watch. She'd said what needed to be said. Baker went to bed and slept deeply for the first time in 58 years. Epilogue. 6 months later, May 2026. Linda Baker died peacefully in her sleep on May 3rd, 2026 at the age of 94. Her obituary in the Washington Post mentioned her distinguished career at the National Security Agency and her contributions to signals intelligence during the Cold War. It did not mention USS Liberty or Sine Wave. Evan Carter attended her funeral in Arlington. A military honor guard was present. Several elderly former NSA colleagues paid their respects. The ONI officer in the grey suit stood in the back, watching. After the service, Carter found a manila envelope on his car windshield, secured under the wiper blade. Inside, a USB drive and a handwritten note in Linda Baker's shaky script, dated 2 weeks before her death. Mr. Carter, if you're reading this, I'm gone. Enclosed is everything I kept over the years. Documents, audio files, analysis. Use your judgment. Some truths are worth the cost, some aren't. You'll have to decide. But decide honestly. Don't let fear make the choice for you. Those sailors died for a secret. Make sure their deaths meant something. LB. Carter plugged the USB drive into his laptop that night. Hundreds of files. Scanned documents from the 1960s and 70s. Audio recordings, technical analyses, Linda Baker's complete archive of everything she'd learned about Operation Cyan Wave. At the bottom of the directory, one video file for Evan.mp4. He clicked it. Linda Baker appeared on screen, sitting in her living room, clearly unwell but sharp-eyed. The timestamp showed it had been recorded 3 days before her death. "Hello, Evan," she said. "If you're watching this, I kept my promise to myself. I died having told the truth. Everything on this drive is real. Cyan Wave existed. It was tested on Liberty. 34 men died to protect it, and it's still being used today. You have a choice now. Publish this and face the consequences, or put it away and let the secret stay buried. I can't tell you what to do. But I can tell you this. Those sailors didn't have a choice. They were sacrificed by people who saw them as expendable. The least we owe them is the truth. Whatever you decide, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for giving an old woman the courage to finally do the right thing." She smiled sadly. "Good luck, Evan. The truth is a heavy burden, but it's the only thing worth carrying." The video ended. Carter sat in silence, the weight of decision pressing down on him. Outside, Washington, D.C. hummed with the machinery of government, agencies and institutions and classified programs operating in shadows, protecting secrets that might be vital or might be criminal. He thought about Linda Baker, about Mark Reynolds, about Commander McGonagall and 34 sailors who died in the Mediterranean. He thought about truth and consequences, about secrecy and accountability. Then he opened a new document and began to write. The title appeared, Operation Cyan Wave, The Complete Story. Whether he would publish it, whether the world would ever read it, whether the truth would be more than fragments and implications, that remained uncertain. But at least now someone knew. Someone had listened. Someone was carrying the burden forward, and somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean, at precisely 14:13 local time, a low-frequency pulse cycled through the electromagnetic spectrum at 7.83 Hz, detected by satellites and monitoring stations, part of a system that had never stopped evolving, never stopped operating, never stopped echoing across the decades since that June afternoon in 1967. The sound built, layered with meaning and memory. It matched a human heartbeat. It faded into silence, and the world moved on, carrying its secrets, waiting for the day when truth would surface, not as conspiracy but as history, when those 34 sailors would receive something more than a memorial plaque, waiting for the echoes to finally be heard. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story and finding it as fascinating as we do, please consider using your hype points on this video. It really helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know, and it allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the mysteries that keep us all awake at night. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, whether you're watching the sunrise in Tokyo or settling in for the night in London. It's not required, but we genuinely enjoy connecting with our global community. Now, before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a massive thank you to KD Lofty for suggesting this topic. This is one we've been wanting to cover for a long time, and your suggestion was the perfect push we needed. Imagine holding a secret so profound that releasing it could rewrite human history. Imagine being told to stay silent, not by choice, but by order. Now imagine that secret involves the most watched moment in television history, the Apollo 11 moon landing, and what 3 astronauts allegedly saw on the lunar surface that was never meant to reach the public. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most explosive conspiracy theories ever to emerge from the space race, a missing transmission, a hidden film reel, and the terrifying possibility that humanity's first steps on the moon were also our first encounter with something we were never supposed to find. Apollo 11. The transmission they never released. Part 1. The engineer's confession. The fluorescent lights in the Euston diner flickered as journalist Marcus Webb sat across from a man who looked like he'd been carrying the weight of the world for 50 years. Ernest Hale was 83 years old, his hands trembling slightly as they wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. The wrinkles on his face seemed to deepen in the harsh light, and his eyes, once sharp and calculating during his years as a NASA communications engineer, now held something different. Fear, regret, and an urgent need to unburden himself before time ran out. 2 minutes and 42 seconds, Hale said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's how much they cut. Marcus had received the cryptic email 3 weeks earlier. No details, just a time and a place, and a single line that had made his investigative instincts flare to life, like a signal fire in the darkness. I know what Armstrong really saw on the moon. As a journalist specialising in declassified government documents and Cold War-era conspiracies, Marcus had heard plenty of wild claims about Apollo 11. Most were easily debunked fantasies, the kind of stories that fell apart the moment you applied even basic scrutiny. But something about Hale's message felt different. The man had credentials, a verifiable 40-year career at NASA, working specifically in communications during the Apollo program. This wasn't some basement-dwelling theorist. This was someone who had been in the room. "You're telling me NASA deliberately cut audio from the moon landing broadcast?" Marcus asked, activating the voice recorder on his phone and sliding it across the table. Hale nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the window where the Texas sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and red. Not just audio. There was a complete transmission blackout for exactly 2 minutes and 42 seconds, right after Armstrong set foot on the surface. The public version shows a brief interruption, static, technical difficulties. That's the official story. But I was in the communications room that night. I heard everything. "And what did you hear?" The old man's hands tightened around his cup. Armstrong's voice, different than before, shaken. He said, and I quote, "They're here. They're watching us." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm Texas evening. They? That's what he said. Houston immediately switched him to the medical channel, the encrypted line. Protocol was that channel was only for health emergencies, astronaut vital signs, things like that. But they used it for something else that day. They used it to have a conversation the world was never meant to hear. Marcus leaned forward, his journalistic skepticism warring with the undeniable conviction in Hale's voice. "Why are you telling me this now? Why wait 50 years? Hale's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Because I'm dying. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors give me 4 months, maybe 6 if I'm lucky. I've kept this secret for half a century because I was afraid. Afraid of losing my pension, afraid of being labelled a lunatic, afraid of what they might do to keep me quiet. But I'm out of time, and I can't take this to my grave. Someone needs to know the truth." The engineer reached into a worn leather satchel beside him and pulled out a manila folder, its edges frayed from age. Inside were photocopied pages, technical diagrams, and what appeared to be mission transcripts with entire sections blacked out. "This is everything I managed to save before they sanitized the records," Hale said, sliding the folder across the table. "Start with July 20th, 1969. Start with the real history, then I'll show you where the lies begin." Part 2. The Descent. Marcus spent the next 3 days immersed in the documented facts of Apollo 11, separating verifiable history from speculation. The mission had launched on July 16th, 1969, from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. 3 men, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, embarked on humanity's most ambitious journey. Their destination was the Sea of Tranquility, a vast lunar plain chosen for its relatively flat terrain. The early stages of the mission proceeded flawlessly. The Saturn V rocket performed exactly as designed, pushing the command module and lunar module out of Earth's orbit and onto a trajectory toward the moon. For 3 days, the crew travelled through the void of space, performing course corrections and systems checks, their every movement monitored by ground control in Houston. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin entered the lunar module, nicknamed Eagle, and began their descent to the surface while Collins remained in the command module, Columbia, orbiting above. This was where the first anomaly occurred, one that was documented in the official records but never fully explained. As Eagle descended toward the lunar surface, computer alarms began screaming in the cramped cockpit. Error code 1201, then 1202. Program alarms that indicated the guidance computer was being overwhelmed with data, receiving more information than it could process. In the official NASA narrative, these alarms were caused by a radar system inadvertently left on, flooding the computer with unnecessary data. Flight controllers in Houston made a split-second decision to proceed with the landing despite the alarms, trusting that the computer could handle the essential functions even while overloaded. But in Hale's documents, in the margins of a photocopied mission transcript, someone had written in pencil, "Alarms triggered by external scan. Eagle detected and scanned by." The question mark hung there, ominous and unfinished. Armstrong took manual control of Eagle, guiding it away from a boulder-strewn crater toward a smoother landing site. At this point, fuel was running critically low. The mission clock showed they had less than 30 seconds of landing fuel remaining when Armstrong's voice crackled through the speakers in Houston. "Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed." The date was July 20th, 1969. The time was 8:17 post-meridium Universal Time. Humanity had reached the moon, but according to Hale, something was already waiting there. Part 3. The First Steps and the Missing Minutes. 6.5 hours after landing, Neil Armstrong opened the hatch of the lunar module and began his careful descent down the ladder. The world watched grainy black and white images transmitted from a camera mounted on Eagle's exterior. An estimated 600 million people across the globe had their eyes fixed on television screens, witnessing something that had existed only in science fiction just a decade before. At 10:56 post-meridium Eastern Time, Armstrong's boot touched the lunar surface. His words became instant history. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The broadcast continued for several minutes, showing Armstrong's initial movements on the surface, his commentary about the fine, powdery consistency of the lunar soil, and his growing confidence in the low-gravity environment. Then, at approximately 11:02 post-meridium Eastern Time, the broadcast experienced what NASA described as a technical interruption. Static-filled television screens around the world. Walter Cronkite, anchoring CBS's coverage, assured viewers that engineers were working to restore the signal. The interruption lasted 2 minutes and 42 seconds, just as Hale had said. When the feed returned, Armstrong was further from the lunar module, collecting samples, and everything appeared normal. The mission proceeded. Aldrin joined him on the surface. They planted the American flag, collected rocks, set up scientific instruments, and spoke with President Nixon via a radio hookup. Then they returned to Eagle, launched back to orbit, docked with Columbia, and began the journey home. The official explanation for the broadcast interruption was a temporary failure in the signal relay from the Australian tracking station at Honeysuckle Creek. Equipment malfunction. Nothing unusual. The missing minutes were simply dead air, static, an unfortunate technical glitch in an otherwise flawless broadcast. But Hale's documents told a different story. In the folder he'd given Marcus was a page that appeared to be from an internal NASA communications log. Most of it was standard technical jargon, signal strength readings, tracking data, confirmation of uplink and downlink status. But there was one entry, time-stamped at 11:01 post-meridium Eastern Time, that made Marcus's heart race. Switch to med channel on CDR request. Override standard protocol. Restricted transcript to follow. Public feed hold for 2.7 minutes. CDR commander. Neil Armstrong had requested the channel switch himself. And there was something else in the folder. A fragmentary transcript labelled Apollo 11 EVA Medical Channel Excerpt, July 20, 1969, 11:01 to 11:03 p.m. Eastern. Most of it was redacted, thick black lines covering entire paragraphs, but a few lines remained visible. Armstrong. Houston, we have... There are other craft here. Repeat, other craft. Houston. Say again, Eagle. Armstrong. They're on the ridge. 3 of them. Lined up. They're watching us. Houston. Stand by, Eagle. Switching to... The rest was blacked out. Marcus read the fragment a dozen times, his mind racing. If this was authentic, if Armstrong had really reported seeing craft on the moon, then the implications were staggering. But he needed more than a photocopied document from a dying man. He needed corroboration. That's when Hale mentioned the second camera feed. Part 4. The hidden feed. According to Hale, there were 2 video channels transmitting from the Apollo 11 mission. The public feed, broadcast worldwide, originated from the camera mounted on Eagle's descent stage. But there was a second feed, encrypted and transmitted on a classified frequency, that went directly to a secure facility in Houston, with simultaneous feeds to Langley Air Force Base and the Pentagon. The second camera was inside Armstrong's helmet, Hale explained during their second meeting, this time at his modest ranch house on the outskirts of Houston. Part of the biomedical monitoring system officially. It was supposed to record the astronauts' field of view for training and debriefing purposes. But the real reason was reconnaissance. The Air Force wanted independent visual confirmation of everything the astronauts encountered. And you saw this second feed? Marcus asked. Hale nodded. I was part of the team monitoring communications integrity. I had access to all the channels, including the restricted ones. When Armstrong made his first report about the craft, they switched the helmet camera feed to the main screen in the control room. That's when I saw them. Them! Structures. On a ridge about half a mile from the landing site, cylindrical, metallic. They weren't natural formations. The shadows they cast were geometric, precise, and while we watched, one of them moved. Marcus felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Moved how? It rotated, slowly, like it was tracking Armstrong's position. Then the feed cut out. Someone at a higher pay grade than me pulled the plug. When it came back online 30 seconds later, the camera was pointed at the ground. We never saw those structures again. And no one said anything? No one questioned it? Hale's expression hardened. 3 people in that room saw what I saw. 2 of them are dead now. The 3rd won't return my calls. We were told immediately after the mission that what we'd witnessed was classified under national security protocols. We signed additional non-disclosure agreements. We were reminded that violating those agreements would be considered treason. Marcus tried to process this. But why? If there were structures on the moon, artificial structures, why hide it? That would be the most significant discovery in human history. Think about it, Hale said quietly. July 1969. We're still in the Cold War. We've just beaten the Soviets to the moon by a matter of months. Now imagine announcing to the world that we found evidence of non-human intelligence up there. What happens? Panic? Maybe. But more importantly, what happens to the space race? Do the Americans and Soviets suddenly start cooperating? Do other nations demand access to lunar exploration? Do we lose our strategic advantage? So you're saying they covered it up for geopolitical reasons. I'm saying they covered it up because they didn't know what they were dealing with. Were these structures abandoned? Active? Were they watching us? Could they be hostile? The people making decisions decided it was safer to study this quietly, secretly, rather than denounce it to a world that wasn't ready. Marcus leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. I need to verify this. I need to talk to other people who were there. Hale smiled sadly. Good luck. Most of them are dead or won't talk. But there's one person you might try. Rosa Klein. She worked in the NASA archives for 30 years. She might remember some things. Part 5. The Archivist's Evidence. Rosa Klein lived in a small apartment in Pasadena, California, surrounded by stacks of books, photographs, and memories of a lifetime spent preserving humanity's reach into space. She was 76 years old, sharp as a tack, and deeply suspicious when Marcus first contacted her. Ernest Hale sent you? She asked over the phone, her voice guarded. I haven't spoken to Ernest in 20 years. Why would he send someone to me now? Because he's dying, Marcus said simply, and he wants the truth to come out before he goes. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally Klein sighed. Come to Pasadena, we'll talk. but I'm not promising anything. 3 days later, Marcus sat in Clean's cramped living room, drinking tea from delicate china cups that seemed wildly out of place given the conversation they were about to have. I worked in the NASA archives from 1972 to 2002, Clean began, her eyes distant with memory. My job was to catalogue, preserve, and maintain access to mission documentation, photographs, film, audio recordings, everything. Apollo 11 was before my time, but the documentation from that mission was extensive. Thousands of photographs, hours of film, telemetry data, mission reports. And you found something unusual? Marcus prompted. Clean set down her teacup carefully. In 1987, I was conducting a routine inventory of Apollo 11 photographic materials. We had recently digitised a batch of images, and I was cross-referencing the digital copies against the physical archives. That's when I noticed discrepancies. What kind of discrepancies? Missing images. The photo manifest, the official list of every photograph taken during the mission, listed several images that weren't in the archive. The designations were sequential, standard NASA format, as 11-something something. But when I tried to locate the physical photographs, they were gone. And here's the strange part. The gaps in the sequence all fell within a specific time frame. Let me guess, Marcus said. Right after the landing? Klein nodded. The missing images were all from the first 40 minutes Armstrong and Aldrin were on the surface. I filed a report about the discrepancy. 2 weeks later, my supervisor called me into his office and told me I'd made a mistake. The missing photos had never existed. The manifest I'd seen was an early draft that included planned photos that were never actually taken due to time constraints. But you didn't believe that? Of course not. I'd been doing that job for 15 years. I knew the difference between a preliminary photo plan and a completed mission manifest. But I also knew when to keep my mouth shut. I let go. Officially. And unofficially? Klein stood and walked to a bookshelf crammed with binders and folders. She pulled out a slim blue folder and handed it to Marcus. Inside was a photocopy of a document, yellowed with age but still legible. It was a photo manifest stamped with official NASA headers and dated August 5th, 1969. Marcus scanned the list of image designations, his pulse quickening as he saw the gaps Klein had mentioned. AS-11-43 through AS-11-51 were missing. 8 consecutive images. I made a copy before they sanitized the records, Klein said quietly. I knew someday someone would ask questions. I just didn't think it would take this long. What do you think those photos showed? Klein sat back down, her hands folded in her lap. I think they showed whatever Armstrong and Aldrin saw on that ridge. I think someone at NASA or the Pentagon decided those images were too sensitive to remain in the public archive, so they removed them and pretended they never existed. Marcus felt the pieces starting to come together, but he still needed more. Did you ever hear anything else? Rumours? Gossip? Anything about what might have been on those photos? Klein hesitated, then nodded slowly. There was an old technician, worked in photo processing during the Apollo era. He retired in the late 80s. We used to have lunch sometimes, talk shop. One day, after a few drinks, he told me about a special project he'd worked on. He called it the clean-up detail. Clean-up? His job was to retouch lunar surface photos before they were released to the public. NASA claimed it was just to enhance clarity, improve contrast, make the images more suitable for publication, but he said they were removing things. Shadows that didn't match the terrain, reflections that couldn't be explained, dark silhouettes on distant horizons. Marcus's mind was racing. Did he say specifically what they were removing? He wouldn't give details, but he did say one thing I've never forgotten. He said the moon wasn't empty when we got there. He said it was never empty. Part 6. The Astronaut's Silence. Michael Collins, the third member of the Apollo 11 crew, orbited the moon alone in the command module Columbia, while Armstrong and Aldrin made history on the surface below. Every public account emphasized his isolation. The loneliest man in the universe, they called him, cut off from all human contact during his passes around the moon's far side. But according to Hale's documents, Collins made his own disturbing observations during those solitary orbits. Marcus tracked down a former NASA public affairs officer who'd worked with Collins during post-mission appearances. The man, who insisted on anonymity, agreed to meet at a bar in Clear Lake, Texas, not far from the Johnson Space Center. Collins was different after Apollo 11, the former officer said, nursing a beer and keeping his voice low despite the noise of the sports bar around them. Armstrong and Aldrin got all the attention, obviously, but Collins was the one who seemed most affected by the experience. He did the appearances, the tours, the press conferences, but there was something in his eyes, like he'd seen something that changed him. Did he ever talk about it? Marcus asked. Not publicly, but there were private moments. I travelled with him for 2 years after the mission, helping coordinate media appearances. One night we're in a hotel in Tokyo, both of us jet-lagged, sitting in the bar at 3 a.m. He's had a few drinks, more than usual, and he starts talking about the far side of the moon. Marcus leaned closer. What did he say? He said being on the far side was strange. Total radio silence from Earth, from Houston, from the lunar module. Just him and the cosmos. He said that's when he saw it. Saw what? The former officer took a long drink before answering. A light, moving alongside Columbia. At first he thought it was debris, part of the spacecraft, or maybe something from the lunar module, but it paced him. Matched his orbital velocity perfectly. Stayed at a constant distance. He watched it for 3 complete orbits. Then, right as he was about to come back around to the near side, it accelerated and disappeared. Did he report it? He said he did, on the private channel once he re-established contact with Houston. They told him it was probably space junk or an optical illusion from the sun reflecting off particles. But Collins didn't buy it. He said he knew what space debris looked like, and this wasn't it. This was deliberate. This was something watching him. Marcus felt his excitement building. Is there any record of this report? The former officer shook his head. If there is, it's buried deep. Collins never mentioned it publicly. But here's the thing. I wasn't the only one he told. There were others over the years. People he trusted. We all signed NDAs, promised never to discuss conversations we had with the astronauts. But I figure after 50-some years, and with you already digging into this, maybe it's time. Back in his hotel room that night, Marcus reviewed everything he'd gathered so far. Hale's testimony about the transmission blackout and the helmet camera feed. Klein's evidence of missing photographs and image manipulation. Now Collins's unreported sighting in lunar orbit. The pattern was becoming clear. Multiple independent sources all pointing to the same conclusion. Something happened during Apollo 11 that was deliberately concealed from the public. But he still needed the smoking gun. He needed direct testimony from one of the astronauts themselves. That's when he remembered Hale mentioning Buzz Aldrin. Part 7. The Aldrin Interview. Buzz Aldrin was the second human to walk on the moon, and over the decades since Apollo 11, he'd become known for his candour, his willingness to speak about his experiences and struggles. He'd discussed his battles with depression and alcoholism, his frustrations with NASA, bureaucracy, his thoughts on the future of space exploration. And on a few notable occasions he'd hinted at something unusual during the Apollo 11 mission. Marcus found a reference to a 1996 interview that Aldrin had done with a small aerospace magazine. The interview had never been published, supposedly due to editorial disagreements. But the journalist who conducted it, a woman named Patricia Hammond, was still alive and working as a freelance writer in Florida. When Marcus called her, Hammond's response was immediate and defensive. "I don't talk about that interview. I signed an agreement." "With NASA?" Marcus asked. "With lawyers representing NASA. They made it very clear that certain portions of my conversation with Aldrin were not suitable for publication. They compensated me for my time and my silence." "But you still have the recording?" A long pause. Then quietly, "Maybe." It took 3 more phone calls, a promise to keep her name out of any publication, and a wire transfer of $5,000 before Hammond agreed to send Marcus a digital copy of the suppressed portion of the interview. What he heard made his hands shake. The interview audio was scratchy, clearly recorded on older equipment, but the voices were clear. Hammond asking questions, Aldrin answering thoughtfully, until she asked about the famous UFO sighting during Apollo 11. In public statements over the years, Aldrin had acknowledged seeing something unusual during the flight to the moon, but always with caveats. It was probably a panel from the spacecraft separation. It could have been debris, nothing definitive. But in this unpublished interview, his tone was different. Hammond: "There's been a lot of speculation about what you saw on the way to the moon. Can you describe it?" Aldrin: "We saw something. All three of us. It was following us, maintaining distance. It wasn't debris, because debris doesn't maintain formation. It wasn't the Saturn IV panel, because we could see that tumbling away in a different direction." Hammond: "What did it look like?" Aldrin: "Cylindrical. Metallic. When the sun hit it at certain angles, it was brilliant. Other times it was dark, almost invisible. We reported it to Houston on a private channel." Hammond: "And what did Houston say?" Aldrin: "They told us not to discuss it publicly. They said it would cause unnecessary panic. But that wasn't the strangest part." Hammond: "What was the strangest part?" Aldrin: Long pause. "When we landed on the moon, there were 3 more of them, on the ridge, just like the one that followed us. Same shape, same size, like they were waiting." Hammond: "You reported this as well?" Aldrin: "Of course. Neil did, immediately. That's when they cut the public feed and put us on the encrypted channel. They didn't want the world to hear what we were describing." Hammond: "What did you describe?" Aldrin: "Structures, technology, something that definitely wasn't human. We were told very clearly that this information was classified under national security protocols. We were told that discussing it could jeopardize not just the space program, but national security itself." Hammond: "And you've kept quiet all these years?" Aldrin: "What choice did I have? You think I wanted to be labelled a crackpot? You think I wanted to spend the rest of my life being questioned about little green men? But I'll tell you this, what we saw was real. It was there. And someone needs to find out what it was and why we were told to stay silent." The recording ended there. According to Hammond, that's when Aldrin's publicist had intervened, ended the interview, and initiated the legal process to suppress the recording. Marcus listened to it 5 more times, making detailed notes. This was it. Direct testimony from one of the Apollo 11 astronauts, on record, describing exactly what Hale had claimed: the structures on the ridge, the encrypted communication channel, the directive to remain silent, but he still needed to know what happened next. What did NASA do with this information? Where did it go? The answer, according to Hale, lay in a classified debriefing that took place 8 days after the astronauts returned to Earth. Part 8. The Secret Debriefing. On July 28, 1969, the Apollo 11 crew underwent their official mission debrief at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston. The public version of this debrief covered technical aspects of the flight, equipment performance, scientific observations, and recommendations for future missions. The transcript runs to hundreds of pages and has been publicly available for decades. But according to documents Hale provided, there was a second classified debriefing that same day. This one took place in a secure conference room with only select personnel present. No press, no public record. And according to a fragmentary transcript Hale had managed to preserve, the discussion was explosive. The partial transcript Marcus received was heavily redacted, but enough remained to paint a disturbing picture. Classified Debriefing, Apollo 11. Crew date, July 28, 1969. Location, Building 30, Manned Spacecraft Center. Present, redacted, redacted. N. Armstrong, E. Aldrin, M. Collins, redacted. Redacted. Gentlemen, this session is classified top secret. Nothing discussed here leaves this room. Is that understood? Armstrong. Understood. Redacted. Commander Armstrong, please describe in detail what you observed at 11:01 Eastern Time on July 20th. Armstrong. After exiting the LM and conducting initial surface assessment, I observed 3 cylindrical objects on a ridge approximately 0.8 kilometers from our position. The objects were metallic in appearance, vertical orientation, approximately redacted. Size estimate, Armstrong, difficult to gauge at that distance, but estimated between 40 and 60 feet in height. They were arranged in a linear pattern, evenly spaced. Redacted. Movement? Armstrong. The centre object appeared to rotate slowly. The rotation was observable due to a reflective surface that caught sunlight intermittently. I observed this for approximately 90 seconds before Houston requested channel switch. Redacted. Colonel Aldrin, did you observe these objects as well? Aldrin. Yes. When I exited the LM approximately 20 minutes later, I looked toward the ridge Armstrong had described. The objects were still visible. I observed what appeared to be independent illumination, a glow that wasn't consistent with solar reflection. Collins. I'd like to add something. Redacted. Go ahead. Collins. During my solo orbits, I observed a similar object maintaining position relative to Columbia. This was consistent across multiple orbits. The object matched our velocity and altitude precisely. When I reported this, I was instructed to... The transcript cuts off here. The remainder of the document was missing, but Hale had provided context in his notes. According to him, the debriefing had concluded with explicit instructions to the crew. They were to maintain absolute silence about their observations. They were told that investigation into the phenomena was ongoing at the highest levels of government, and that premature disclosure could compromise both national security and the space program itself. The astronauts had complied. For 50 years they'd carried the secret. But the government's investigation, according to Hale, had continued in the shadows. Part 9. The Pentagon Connection. The Defense Intelligence Agency had maintained close oversight of the Apollo program from its inception. While NASA was a civilian agency, the military implications of space exploration were obvious. Reconnaissance, communications, potential weapons platforms, all of these fell within DoD's purview. So when Apollo 11 reported anomalous objects on the lunar surface, it was the DIA that took the lead in analysing the implications. Marcus managed to track down a former DIA analyst who'd worked on aerospace intelligence during the late 1960s. The man, who insisted on using only the pseudonym Thomas, agreed to speak on condition of complete anonymity. The Apollo 11 findings triggered a complete reassessment of our understanding of the lunar environment, Thomas said during their secure video call. We'd been sending probes to the moon since the early 60s, Ranger, Surveyor, Lunar Orbiter. None of them had detected anything unusual. No structures, no anomalies. So when the Apollo crew reported what they saw, the initial reaction was skepticism. But they investigated, Marcus asked. Extensively. We pulled every photograph, every piece of telemetry data, every communication transcript. We analysed sun angles, shadow patterns, optical illusions. We even considered the possibility that the crew was hallucinating, some kind of psychological break from the stress of the mission. But you couldn't explain it away. Thomas was silent for a long moment. No, the evidence was too consistent. 3 trained observers, all reporting the same phenomena independently. Visual confirmation from multiple angles. And then there were the photographs. The missing photographs from the archive, Marcus prompted. Those photos weren't missing. They were moved, classified. I saw some of them during the initial analysis. They showed exactly what the crew described. Cylindrical structures, geometric precision, surface composition inconsistent with natural lunar formations. So what did you conclude? Officially? The analysis was inconclusive. We couldn't definitively prove the objects were artificial, so we couldn't justify public disclosure. Unofficially, every analyst who saw that data knew we were looking at something that didn't belong there, something that predated our arrival. Alien technology? Thomas laughed bitterly. That's the obvious conclusion, isn't it? But here's the thing that bothered us most. The objects weren't ancient. They weren't covered in lunar dust. They weren't degraded by micrometeorite impacts or radiation. They looked new, which meant either they were recently placed there, or they were maintained somehow. That's terrifying. It gets worse. We analysed the trajectory of the object Collins reported shadowing the command module. Based on its behaviour, matching orbital velocity, maintaining precise distance, it would have required sophisticated propulsion and guidance systems, more sophisticated than anything we had at the time. maybe more sophisticated than anything we have now. Marcus felt a chill run through him. So what happened? Where did the investigation go from there? Above my pay grade, Thomas said. The analysis was kicked up to a special projects division. I heard rumours it was folded into a broader programme studying unexplained aerial phenomena, what we called UAPs, but the specifics were compartmentalised, need to know only, and I didn't need to know. Do you think we went back? Secretly? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We had 6 more Apollo missions after 11. 5 of them successfully landed on the moon. If I were running the program, I would have absolutely sent crews to investigate those structures, get closer, get better images, maybe even attempt contact. But whether that actually happened, I have no idea. The conversation left Marcus with more questions than answers, but it confirmed a crucial point. The Pentagon had taken the Apollo 11 observations seriously enough to launch a classified investigation, which meant the government believed something real had been detected on the moon. Now he needed to know what they found. Part 10. The Photo Laboratory. Following a lead from Rosa Klein, Marcus travelled to the former, site of Building 8 at the Manned Spacecraft Center, now the Johnson Space Center. The building no longer existed, demolished in the early 2000s during a facilities modernisation project. But Klein had given him a name, Victor Reeves, a former photo technician who'd worked in Building 8 during the Apollo era. Reeves was 79 years old and living in a retirement community in Arizona. When Marcus called, the old man's voice was surprisingly strong and clear. "Building 8, Reeves said with a dry chuckle. "Haven't thought about that place in years. What's your interest?" Marcus explained his investigation, mentioning Hale's claims about photo manipulation and Klein's discovery of missing images. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then, "I wondered when someone would finally start asking the right questions. Yeah, I worked the photo lab in Building 8 from 67 to 73. And yeah, we did cleanup work on Apollo images. Lots of it. Can you describe what that involved?" Officially, we were enhancing image quality, adjusting contrast, sharpening details, removing artifacts from the development process, and we did do that work. But there was another project. Smaller team, higher security clearance. We called it the Anomaly Review, which involved taking lunar surface photographs and removing anything that didn't fit the expected profile. And before you ask, yes, that included things that appeared artificial, geometric shapes, reflective surfaces where there shouldn't be reflections, shadows that didn't match the sun angle. We'd airbrush them out, retouch the surrounding terrain to make it look natural. How many photos are we talking about? From Apollo 11 specifically, maybe 20, 25 images, but it continued through the other missions. By the end of the Apollo program, we'd cleaned up hundreds of photos. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Did you keep any of the originals? Before the retouching?" Reeves laughed. "Are you kidding? Everything was tracked. Every original, every work print, every final version. They ran inventory checks weekly. Taking anything out of that lab would have been instant dismissal and probably criminal charges. So there's no way to see what was removed?" "I didn't say that." Reeves paused. "Look, I was young, curious, and I had access to a camera. I may have photographed a few work prints before we retouched them. Just for my own records, you understand. Nothing official." Marcus could barely breathe. "You still have those photographs?" "Maybe. They're old, faded. Been sitting in a box in my garage for 50 years. But if you want to come out to Arizona, I suppose I could dig them out." 2 days later, Marcus was sitting in Reeves's small garage, looking at faded Polaroid images that showed the lunar surface before NASA's cleanup crew got to work. The images were exactly as Reeves had described. Angular shadows that didn't match the terrain, bright. Reflections from areas that should have been in darkness. And in 3 photos, clear geometric shapes on distant ridges. One image in particular made Marcus's hand shake. It showed the horizon beyond the Apollo 11 landing site, and there, unmistakably, were 3 vertical structures arranged in a line. The resolution wasn't good enough to show fine details, but the basic shapes were clear. Cylindrical, metallic, utterly inconsistent with natural geology. "That's what you were looking for, isn't it?" Reeves said quietly. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. "Keep it," Reeves said. "I'm too old to care about NDAs anymore. If someone wants to prosecute an 80-year-old man for showing you a 50-year-old photo, let them try. The world deserves to know the truth." Part 11. Armstrong's Warning. The deeper Marcus dug into the Apollo 11 cover-up, the more he understood why the astronauts had remained silent for so long. The pressure applied to them hadn't just been bureaucratic or legal. It had been personal and intense. He found evidence of this in an unexpected place: the private papers of a former NASA administrator that had been donated to a university archive. Buried in routine correspondence from the 1970s was a memo from a DA liaison to NASA leadership, marked "Eyes Only." The memo, dated April 3, 1970, outlined recommended protocols for managing astronaut testimony regarding classified mission observations. The language was bureaucratic, but the intent was clear. Astronauts who discussed their observations publicly would face administrative consequences, including loss of flight status, pension review, and potential criminal prosecution under espionage laws. But there was one instance where the pressure had almost broken. Marcus discovered this through an interview with the widow of a former NASA public affairs officer. Her husband had died in 2008, but she remembered a story he'd told her about Neil Armstrong at a White House event in 1985. "My husband said Armstrong had been drinking more than usual that night," she recalled. "There was a small reception after the main event, just a few dozen people. Armstrong was talking with some aerospace contractors, and my husband overheard him say something strange. He said, 'We were warned away. They didn't want us there.'" "Warned by who?" Marcus asked. "That's what my husband asked, but Armstrong just shook his head and walked away." The next day, my husband got a call from Armstrong's assistant, asking if he'd overheard anything unusual at the reception. When my husband asked why, the assistant said Armstrong had been under stress and may have made some inappropriate comments. They wanted to make sure nothing made it into the media. "Did your husband report what he heard?" "Not officially, but he told me he always wondered what Armstrong meant. Warned away by who and why?" The answer might have come from another source, a colleague of Armstrong's from his test pilot days who'd stayed in touch over the decades. The man, who asked not to be named, told Marcus about a conversation he'd had with Armstrong in the late 1990s. Neil was different after Apollo 11, the former pilot said. Quieter, more withdrawn. He did his public duties, but you could tell his heart wasn't in it. One day I asked him point blank, I said, "Neil, what really happened up there?" And he just looked at me with these tired eyes and said, "Some things are bigger than one man's conscience." What did he mean by that? I think he meant that he knew things the world should probably know, but that revealing them would cause more harm than good, or at least that's what he'd been convinced of. Part 12. The Final Evidence. Ernest Hale died on a Tuesday morning in late October, 4 months after his first meeting with Marcus. The cancer had progressed faster than the doctors predicted, but before he died, he made one final arrangement. Marcus received a package from Hale's attorney 3 days after the funeral. Inside was a small aluminum case, the kind used for storing film reels, and a handwritten note. "Marcus, if you're reading this, I've run out of time. Inside this case is the most important piece of evidence I managed to save. I've kept it hidden for 50 years, moving it from one secure location to another, always afraid someone would find it and destroy it. Now it's yours. Use it wisely. The truth matters more than my reputation or my legacy. Ernest." Inside the aluminum case was a 16mm film reel, carefully sealed in archival plastic. A label on the reel read, "Apollo 11, EVA restricted, do not duplicate." Marcus's hands trembled as he carefully removed the reel. He'd anticipated this moment, prepared for it by locating a restoration specialist who could safely digitize old film stock. 2 days later, he sat in the specialist's darkened studio and watched the film play on a modern screen. The footage was grainy, occasionally jumping and flickering with age, but it was unmistakably from the lunar surface. The perspective was from Armstrong's helmet camera, the same feed Hale had described seeing in the communications room. The timestamp in the corner showed 11:02 post-meridian Eastern Time, July 20th, 1969. The camera panned across the lunar landscape, grey regolith stretching to a sharp horizon against the black sky. Then the view shifted, focusing on a distant ridge. The image was shaky, affected by Armstrong's breathing and movement, but there was no mistaking what appeared in frame. 3 cylindrical structures, exactly as described in all the testimonies Marcus had gathered. They were metallic, catching the harsh sunlight and casting precise geometric shadows on the lunar surface. The centre structure appeared to be rotating slowly, its surface reflecting light in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic. Then the audio kicked in, scratchy and broken but audible. A voice, Armstrong's, tight with tension. "Houston, do you copy this feed?" Static, then another voice from Houston. "We copy, Eagle. Maintain visual contact." Armstrong again. "It's moving, the centre one, it's rotating toward my position." Another voice, Aldrin's, in the background. "Neil, it's tracking you, it's definitely tracking you." Houston. "Stand by, Eagle, we're analysing." The camera continued to focus on the structures for another 30 seconds. Then suddenly the centre structure seemed to flare with light, a brilliant reflection that washed out the camera for several frames. When the image cleared, the camera was pointed at the ground. Armstrong's breathing was audible, rapid and shallow. Houston. "Eagle, redirect to surface sample collection. Acknowledge." Armstrong. "Acknowledged." The footage ran for another 10 seconds, showing only lunar soil, then cut to black. Marcus watched the film 6 times in total, making detailed notes, capturing screenshots, ensuring he had documented every frame. This was it. Physical evidence of exactly what Hale, Aldrin, and the others had described. It wasn't proof of alien life, but it was undeniable proof that something anomalous had been present on the moon during Apollo 11, and that NASA had deliberately concealed it. But as Marcus prepared to publish his findings, as he compiled all the evidence he'd gathered over 6 months of intensive investigation, something happened that changed everything. Part 13, The Message. The email arrived at 3:37 in the morning, jolting Marcus awake with its notification chime. The sender was listed as Concerned Observer, and the subject line read, "Before you publish." Marcus opened it with growing dread. "Marcus Webb, we know what you found. We know about Hale's testimony, Klein's documents, the Aldrin interview and the film. We've been watching your investigation with interest. Before you make the decision to release this information publicly, you should know something that Ernest Hale didn't. You should know what Apollo 12 found at the Ocean of Storms." The email included a single attachment, a PDF file with a simple title, Surveyor 3 Recovery Mission, Classified Addendum. Apollo 12 had landed on the moon in November 1969, just 4 months after Apollo 11. One of its mission objectives was to reach the Surveyor 3 probe, an unmanned lander that had touched down in April 1967. The astronauts successfully retrieved parts of Surveyor 3, bringing them back to Earth for analysis. That was the public story. The classified addendum told a very different tale. According to the document, when the Apollo 12 crew reached Surveyor 3, they found something unexpected. The probe had been moved, not by much, perhaps 15 feet from its original landing site, but it had definitely been relocated deliberately, carefully, and then set down in a new position. More disturbing, Surveyor 3's camera, which had been pointed west in all the original mission images from '67, was now pointed northeast, toward a series of geometric formations that hadn't been visible in the original photographs. The Apollo 12 crew had photographed these formations extensively, and the classified addendum included several of those images. They showed structures similar to what Armstrong and Aldrin had seen, cylindrical objects arranged in patterns, some partially buried in lunar regolith, others standing free. But there was one crucial difference. These structures appeared older, weathered, covered in the fine dust that accumulates on the lunar surface over time. The document concluded with a chilling assessment. Evidence suggests long-term presence of non-terrestrial technology on the lunar surface. Origin, purpose, and current operational status remain unknown. recommend continued classified investigation and absolute suppression of public disclosure, pending comprehensive threat assessment. The email's message continued below the attachment. This is just the beginning, Marcus. Apollo 14 found more. Apollo 15 made contact. Apollo 16 was warned to leave. Apollo 17 discovered why. If you release what you know about Apollo 11, we will be forced to release the complete record. Are you prepared for the world to know everything? Think carefully about what you're about to do. The email ended with no signature, no contact information, no way to respond. Marcus sat in his dark apartment staring at the screen, his mind racing. The implication was clear. There was far more to the lunar cover-up than just Apollo 11. The evidence he'd gathered was just the tip of an iceberg that extended through the entire Apollo program and possibly beyond. If he published his Apollo 11 findings, whoever sent this email, presumably someone within the intelligence community, with access to the full classified record, would retaliate by releasing even more explosive information. Information about contact, about warnings, about discoveries that might fundamentally challenge humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. Was he ready for that? Was the world ready for that? He thought about Ernest Hale, who'd spent 50 years carrying the weight of this secret, dying with the hope that the truth would finally emerge. He thought about the astronauts who'd been silenced, threatened, forced to deny what they'd witnessed. He thought about the public's right to know, weighed against the potential chaos that full disclosure might unleash. As dawn broke over his apartment window, Marcus sat at his computer, his article complete and ready to publish. Everything he'd found, every interview, every document, the film footage, all of it compiled into a comprehensive exposé that would change history. His finger hovered over the publish button. On his other screen, the email from Concerned Observer remained open, its threat hanging in the digital air like a sword. If you release what you know about Apollo 11, we will release the complete record. Marcus Webb had spent his entire career searching for the truth, exposing secrets, bringing hidden information into the light. But now, faced with the biggest story of his life, he found himself paralysed by a terrible question. What if some truths are too dangerous to tell? The cursor blinked on the screen. Publish. Don't publish. The choice that would define his legacy and possibly humanity's future. Outside, the sun rose over another ordinary day, in a world that had no idea what secrets lurked in the shadows of its greatest achievement. Marcus's finger remained frozen over the keyboard. The film reel sat in its aluminum case on his desk, 3 cylindrical structures captured forever on 16mm film, rotating slowly under an alien sun, watching, waiting, as they had been for 50 years. And somewhere in the classified archives of the United States government, the complete record of humanity's first contact waited in the darkness, neither confirmed nor denied, neither revealed nor forgotten, existing in that strange quantum state of truth that is simultaneously known and unknown, believed and doubted, terrifying and magnificent. The story of Apollo 11, the transmission they never released, remained balanced on the edge of revelation, as close to the light as it had ever been, and yet still shrouded in the same shadows that had concealed it since that July day in 1969, when 3 men looked up at structures on a lunar ridge and had their reality forever transformed. Marcus Webb stared at his screen, the weight of history pressing down on him, the future hanging in the balance, and the cursor blinked. Publish. Don't publish. The choice was his alone, but the truth, whatever it was, wherever it led, continued to exist independent of his decision, waiting in the lunar dust, patient and eternal, for the day when humanity would finally be ready to face what it had found among the stars.